Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone online. I know we have over 100 people joining us online, and good afternoon to all of you who are here in person. My name is Sue Lieberman. I know many of you, but not all of you. I'm Vice President for International Policy with the Wildlife Conservation Society. You'll be pleased to know I'm not giving a speech. And I won't talk about the more than 35 years that I've worked on wildlife trade, but I will be moderating today, and we have some excellent speakers. And I want to thank all of you for joining us at this conference, which is jointly organized by the European Commission, the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the European Union, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And particularly want to thank Arnaud Gussens for all the tremendous work in organizing us today. In terms of wildlife trafficking, you're all here, so I don't have to tell you what a scourge it is. It is one of the most lucrative criminal activities, and it's a significant threat to wildlife and local communities around the world. Now, this isn't something that started yesterday, and many of us have worked on this for many years, and things that have been done and put in place had some successes, but we haven't solved the problem. And we haven't stopped wildlife trafficking. So we're going to hear some new ways of looking at this problem, new ways of looking at solution, new action plan from the European Union, and discuss some of the ways we can tackle this problem with possibly a new paradigm, a new way of looking at it. That doesn't mean throwing out the old ways of looking at it, but building on top of all of the lessons learned. We value your input, both online and here in person. And I think Arnaud is in charge, but what is it called? It's called Slido, that you can post questions, those of you online. We will have time for questions in person and online, unless our speakers go over on time. So there's an incentive to our speakers not to go over on time. We will first hear from distinguished guests from DG Environment and the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the European Union, and then we will have 4 technical sessions on capacity building, behavior science, and crime science, and a short video. And I assure you there is a reception afterwards, so the weather's horrible anyhow. Please stay around. But let's use this as an opportunity in the question session as well as in the reception to challenge each other, challenge assumptions, and look at new ways of combating this problem. So I said I wouldn't give a speech. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our first distinguished speaker, Astrid Schomaker, the Director for Global Sustainable Development at DG Environment of the European Commission. Please.
Well, thank you, Sue. And I think listening to you, all of us would have wished you'd given a speech because you started off so well and it was so interesting. So instead, it's now me. And on behalf of the European Commission, of course, I start by thanking you, Sue, and all the colleagues from WCS for all your work you did for this event. And of course, also the colleagues from the Spanish Presidency, who, as you've heard, have been organizing this together with us. So what I wanted to do just before diving briefly into the substance matter, just to put it a little bit into the broader context. And the broader context in Europe, and those of you who were here at the center of the European bubble, you know that, of course, the broader context is the European Green Deal. But much as we love to think that everybody knows the European Green Deal, I nonetheless want to say a couple of words about it. And ultimately, what this Green Deal, the #1 priority of the European Commission, is about is taking the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution seriously, recognizing that transformative action is necessary because we are facing what is actually an emergency, an existential emergency, but then also recognizing that this action can actually be taken in a way that is good for the economy, that creates new jobs, creates new business opportunity, creates livelihoods around the world. And getting that right is the challenge of the European Green Deal. And nature is very much at the center of all of that. And therefore, what we're doing here today really matters. And again, those of you in the European bubble know there's a lot of pushback at the moment against too much nature legislation, too much protection. But it is actually the business community that has first reminded us that more than half of global GDP depends on nature, directly or indirectly. And it is the World Economic Forum that in its 2023 risk report has identified biodiversity loss as the fourth most important risk for the global economy in the next decade, along with the failure to address climate mitigation and adaptation and risks related to natural disasters that we could all see play out this summer already. So if nature is at the center of what we need to be concerned about, combating wildlife is a really important part of this, or wildlife trafficking. Well, it is a really important part of that, and therefore it forms part of our biodiversity strategy, but also, and very importantly in a global perspective, it is important enough to be one of the targets of the global biodiversity framework that was adopted at COP15 of the CBD in December. So coming back to this idea that more than half of the global economy depends on nature, what is interesting here is that it's actually an issue that brings together the so-called global north and the global south, because it is in the world's biggest economies, like China, the US, and the European Union, that we are the most dependent for our economic value on nature-dependent industries. And conversely, it is in the poorest countries, where 70% of the world's most vulnerable people actually rely directly on wild species. So once again, what we do here really matters. And the illegal trade of species, as Sue was already saying in the beginning, of course, comes into play as a driver of global biodiversity loss. It has a destructive socioeconomic impact. And again, Sue has said that it brings risks for public health, as we know. And of course, it also decreases the possibility for many local communities to have legal and sustainable incomes. And today, wildlife crime, wildlife trafficking has become one of the most profitable forms of organized crime, globally worth up to $20 billion per year. That's unfortunately a figure that's still on the increase. And as such, it is, of course, a serious threat to the rule of law and to legitimate institutions. Now, coming to the role of the EU in all of that, we have an important place in this wildlife trade. We're a key region of destination, of transit, and of origin. So in a way, we're a hub for illegal trade. So that comes with a responsibility to regulate legal trade in wildlife, as well as to fight against wildlife trafficking. And that now brings me to the Wildlife Action Plan. We're all here to discuss, and you will hear a lot more about it in the course of this afternoon. So let me just focus on a few elements that we think are particularly important. First of all, this Wildlife Action Plan didn't somehow fall from the sky last year. It builds on a previous EU action plan. So we've revised the previous action plan, looking at the new challenges that have arisen and trying to adapt and make use of new instruments and policies that have become available, and at the same time also find ways or identify existing policies that should be implemented more effectively. And there's so many aspects to this topic that addressing just one will never actually bring the results we want to see. So the action plan attempts to capture the complexity of this program and address it in a comprehensive way, making links with other relevant instruments and policies. And with the complexity, of course, also comes the complexity of actors and a multitude of actors that need to be involved if we want to have real impact. So for the EU action plan to be successful, it has to be implemented, of course, by my colleagues here from the European Commission that are amongst us, by the CITES authorities, and many of you are here or online in the EU member states, but also by other relevant authorities, agencies, international organizations, civil society, and importantly, the private sector within the EU and outside. So a good coordination and exchange of information here really comes into play, and we all know a lot is being done, but we also know a lot still remains to be done in that area, so that we need to put the different strands, or that we put the different strands together in a more successful manner, building on each other's actions, learning from each other. And that's why an event such as the one today we think is so important. It gathers so many of us to jointly discuss challenges and solutions, and of course also develop our expertise and build trust among us, and creating and strengthening connections within this so diverse community. And I'm stressing that really because many actions in the action plan are exactly about this. So building channels for the exchange of information, cooperation and coordination, both within the EU and between our member states, civil society, private sector, and globally with other partner countries. And another element that I would like to stress, and you'll be pleased to know I'm on my last page, is that the need to implement the action plan both at the EU and the EU member states level. And we will today hear some very good examples of national action plans or coordination mechanisms that are in place. And in many ways, we would like to encourage all of us to be inspired by what you hear and adopt those solutions that then are best suited for your national context. And a very important aspect, which I must mention, of course, are always resources, both human and financial. And believe me, in the European Commission, we know about the challenges to find the human and financial resources to combat international wildlife trafficking. It is a super complex issue with many, many competing priorities that you're all aware about, both at EU level and at national level. But I think we cannot stress it enough. It is important to ensure that sufficient resources are devoted to the implementation of the action plan. Not because it's just wildlife in the corner, but because wildlife trafficking is such an integral part of our efforts to protect nature, and our efforts to protect nature are so essential to protect livelihoods around the world and keep our economies going. So ensuring that wildlife trafficking is targeted by relevant EU financial instruments remains a priority for us. And finally, and here I really come now to the closing, it is of course super important that we can also demonstrate that what we do actually makes some kind of difference. And that is why we are working on a monitoring and evaluation framework for the action plan, so that we are able to monitor and are able to come back and say, well, we've put all this in place and we've succeeded here and maybe not so much succeeded there because some more action needs to be done here, etc., etc. But that's really what we have to do. We can't just move forward. We have to also be accountable to the public on what we're doing. So in conclusion, and now I really come to the end, I wish all of us very fruitful discussions today in the successful conference. And we, with all my colleagues from DG Environment here, we count on all of you walking out here with new and concrete ideas and suggestions about how we can do more and can do better in the fight against wildlife trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you in particular for mentioning the target 5, if you don't have them memorized, of the Global Biodiversity Framework, because governments have all committed to it and committed to combating wildlife trafficking and unsustainable trade and trade that risks pathogen spillover. And we really appreciate the leadership and work of the European Union to implement that target. I'm now going to thank you again and turn it over to Mr. Santiago Rodriguez Uriel, the Environment Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Spain to the European Union. And I forgot to remind speakers that Arnaud in the back will hold up a card when you have 2 minutes left. He's going to be doing the timing, and then I'm going to go to the back to make sure that we have a way of getting questions from the audience. So please. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Dr. Lieberman. And I cannot but subscribe your words and the words of Director Schumacher. Yes, each and every word that you said. Well, dear all, I'm very happy that this room is full of people and that there are 100 more people connected through the internet. And it is indeed my pleasure to be here representing the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the European Union, which you can see that it's still standing. No? Yeah, well, as you surely know, or some of you will know, the green transition and the environmental adaptation are one of the 4 main priorities of our presidency. In that context, biodiversity and nature protection, conservation and restoration are very high in our agenda for this semester. In that context too, we were extremely happy to accept the invitation to co-organize, together with the European Commission and the Wildlife Conservation Society, this conference, which addresses, in our view, a topic of great importance, as has been said: wildlife trafficking and the related crimes of poaching and illegal logging. They all represent a growing concern not only to governments but also to the society as a whole. These illegal practices on wildlife have a deleterious impact on biodiversity. They also jeopardize sustainable development in the countries of origin. and they potentially endanger our health and food security worldwide because of the risk of propagation of zoonotic diseases linked to the disruption of the natural balance of ecosystems. The European Action Plan, the WAP, of 2016, the first one, was a good first step to better combat wildlife trafficking by improving coordination among member states. Its revision of 2022, you will hear about it right after my speech, proves that the European Union is firmly decided to fight against wildlife trafficking, both internally and at a global level. The new plan is a booster to our efforts to ensure compliance with rules and regulations, and it includes new perspectives and priorities, such as the connections between exchange of wildlife specimens and spread of zoonotic diseases, which I referred to before. In this regard, I'm sure many of you know that only in the CITES scope, thousands of living specimens are traded internationally every year. Therefore, we fully support taking into account the One Health approach in the context of wildlife trade, in the countries of origin, transit, and destination. On top of that, we must assess the added value and feasibility of a positive list of wild species that can be kept as pet animals. Even if I'm here representing the Council today, let me refer briefly to the member state I know the best. Spain was the first member state to adapt the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking to its national context by approving the TFIES plan. And you will hear about this TFIES plan in some minutes, right after my speech. From our experience, the collaboration of environment and police authorities is key to improve our effectiveness in combating wildlife-related crimes and offenses. The enforcement chain and the engagement of the judiciary should also be strengthened at all levels. Good laws are useless if they are not effectively applied. It is therefore important in this sense to have public officers specialized in the investigation and prosecution of crimes against wildlife, as it is necessary that, in particular, judges and public prosecutors have an adequate specific knowledge about this type of crime. Only in that case there will be effective judgments and sentences with a real dissuasive effect on illegal wildlife traffickers. This is an interesting avenue for the EU to explore, building on the experience of the member states that already have specialized environmental courts or prosecution offices. The preventive link of the chain deserves careful attention too. The environmental guards in the countries of origin need to be well prepared, trained, and equipped for an effective in situ surveillance in constant contact with police forces. The European Union should increase efforts on this side too. And I would like to be short and to finalize my short intervention by saying thank you. Thank you first to the co-organizers of this event, to the European Commission also for its trust to the WAP, to the Wildlife Conservation Society for the interest and energy to launch this conference and for their great work at the global level in the field of biodiversity conservation and the fight against wildlife trafficking. To the speakers of today for their effort to be here and share their experiences. And to all the attendants, to all of you for your interest. I wish you all, and I wish you too, fruitful discussions, because for sure this discussion will help us all to achieve a much needed better cooperation between our institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your words, for mentioning the health issues, of course, as well as for telling us the EU is going to be taking an even closer look at its role in the international pet trade. Very much appreciate that. I'm now going to turn this over to, we're going to have a discussion of the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking, and I'm going to turn it over to Agata Sobiech, the team leader, CITES and wildlife trafficking with DG Environment of the European Commission, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Thank you very much, and it's rarely as well pronounced as you did it, so there are all different versions. Thank you. Yeah, so now comes time for the PowerPoint presentations. But I promise I'll be brief and just have a few slides. So the idea here is just to really give you, to present to you the Wildlife Action Plan, but really in a short way. So first, I think this one already mentioned, but I just want to repeat the three main points. Why do we actually have an action plan at the EU level? Well, first of all, to address the EU responsibility as a global hub for trafficking in wildlife, which was already mentioned. Second is to sort of try to put together the different tools that are there at our disposal. We have financial, regulatory, commercial, operational instruments at the EU level. But we need to know about them and we need to use them in a coordinated way to make sure they can basically build on each other, that we can find the synergies and exploit them. And last but not least, the idea is also to raise the profile of the fight against wildlife trafficking, both within the EU, at the EU level, but also at the member states level, and also internationally with our partners. So that's the overview at a glance. The Commission has adopted the revised action plan against wildlife trafficking on 9th of November 2022. So we are coming close to 1 year anniversary. It was shortly before the COP19 of CITES. And it is supposed to take us up to 2027. It is built around 4 priorities, which you can see listed there, which is preventing wildlife trafficking, addressing its root causes, strengthening the legal and policy framework, enforcement, so enforcing regulations and policies to fight wildlife trafficking effectively, and finally, strengthening the global partnership of source, consumer, and transit countries. As you can see, there are 17 objectives, there are 69 actions, and do not worry, I will not go through them. As Astrid mentioned, it's really an evolution and not a revolution. It really very much builds on the previous action plan, which we found still holds. Many of the things which were there are still true. What we try to do is to have a comprehensive approach that updates what has been done before and sort of updates the framework to respond also to new challenges and trends. Also to make it in line with all the relevant strategies and coherent complementary with new instruments that appeared since then. And I can mention the Environmental Crime Directive, the Digital Services Act, Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, and others. There are a few sort of headlines. One of them is sort of putting more capacity on capacity building along the whole enforcement chain, so not only focusing on police and customs, but also trying to build capacities further up, the prosecution and judges. It also is supposed to really to encourage coordination and cooperation within and between member states. It has a certain focus on the online crime as well, sort of harnessing the future adoption, or at that time, the future adoption of the Digital Services Act, to give to enforcement actors the necessary tools to tackle online wildlife trafficking. And it also calls for more transparency and calling for stronger partnerships of the EU and its member states with other stakeholders, so non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and the private sector, as it was already mentioned. It is a collective effort. There are a lot of institutions, organizations, agencies involved. within member states, of course, the European Commission, and within the European Commission, we're talking about several DGs that have actions in the action plan that they will implement. There's, of course, the EU agencies. There is, of course, the External Action Service and the delegations. There are also networks or professional networks of European prosecutors, judges, or law enforcement authorities, international bodies, and we mentioned only CITES, Interpol, UNODC, World Bank, and World Customs Organization, but there are also others. And as I mentioned, stakeholders, other stakeholders, civil society, private sector, academia, and of course, local communities and indigenous people. So I think since we're coming close to the first anniversary, it's good to see what we have actually done. And those are first, this is just an overview of some of the first developments at the EU level. So as it was mentioned, we are working on monitoring and evaluation framework that will help us to actually show or see whether what we are doing actually brings a change. We have also launched preparatory work for 2 of the policy studies, which are mentioned in the Wildlife Action Plan. One is on criminalizing all wildlife imports to the EU, and another one is of a potential establishment of a positive list for exotic pets. We also have done preparatory work for a project on demand reduction for exotic pets in the EU, a project that hopefully will start at the beginning of next year. We are currently in a very sort of quite actively analyzing the EU approach on hunting trophies. So looking at what we already do and whether things have to be changed. As I mentioned, transparency and cooperation with other stakeholders is an important priority. So this is also something we have engaged in the last months to try to identify concrete steps where we can improve. There is formulation of actions ongoing to fund or to support EU, to have a EU funding for supporting to and cooperation with non-EU countries. There's also already, we increased already coordination with impact, amongst others, for instance, the Commission. So the impact stands for the not only the Brussels bubble, but even the organized crime bubble. The impact stands for European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, which is a sort of integrated approach to EU internal security and fight against organized crime. So this is where environmental crime is one of the priorities, and we are really trying to build on that and engage on that actively. And for instance, we will organize training for judges under this this priority. So those are just some of the developments. I hope more will come, and happy to inform about those in maybe a few months from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Agata. And we're, of course, predictably running a little over on time, but we will have time for some questions. I'm now going to turn it over to Diana Perez Aranda Serrano, you heard about where is she? Yes, thank you. Hi. Plantifies. She's with the Ministry for the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge of the Government of Spain. I like that ministry. Please, Diana.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the presentations, Sue. Well, I'm going to be giving this presentation on the TIFIES plan, that is the Spanish Action Plan Against Wildlife Trafficking and International Poaching of wildlife species. This is not working very well because it was animated. Well, those are the covers of the deliverable voucher of the document of the plan, and well, it was an English version and a Spanish version. It's not working properly because it was animated. Well, okay, well, the Spanish action plan derives from the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking, the one that was approved in 2016. And in 2018, we approved the Spanish action plan, that is the adoption of the EU action plan to the national context. And the name Plantifies derives from the Spanish name of the plan, as you can see there. The Spanish action plan, as I said, was approved in 2018. We became this way the first member state to adopt the EU action plan to the national context, and it was approved by the Council of Ministers. This means that it is the engagement of the Spanish government in the fight against wildlife trafficking. It was elaborated and signed by 5 different ministries, those that have the powers for the enforcement, the scientific and the management authorities for CITES, and also the Ministry of Exteriors, because the Plantifies has actions that develops in third countries. And besides those ministries, it was also signed by the environmental section of the Prosecutor's General's Office. MITECO is the short name for the Ministry of Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge of Spain, has from the beginning been the promoter and the coordinator of the plan, and also from 2022, we are the management authority for CITES. You cannot see this because it was animated, so, okay. The characteristics of the plan, well, it follows the same structure as the WAP. WAP is the Wildlife Action Plan, in the sense that it has priorities, it has measures, and it has actions, but the difference is that it only develops the 26 measures that were assigned to the member states. The other actions are assigned to different European institutions, such as the Commission, Eurojust, Europol, and others. And for those 26 measures, the plan identified the responsible unit of the ministry that had the competence to develop that. And identifying the responsible unit has turned to be key to develop the engagement and the commitment of each of the units that are involved in the plan. So overall, the Plantifies has helped to improve the collaboration and cooperation between different departments that are involved in the fight against wildlife trafficking. A singularity of the action plan, of the Spanish action plan, is that it is inclusive to organizations of the civil society. Organizations that develop initiatives that are related to the goals of the plan. And in this way, we join efforts between the organizations of the civil society and the administrations in the fight against wildlife trafficking. In order to recognize this contribution to the plan, the entities, these organizations have been designated officially as collaborating entities of Plantifies. Amongst the highlighted actions at the national level, we would like to point out those that are framed within the collaboration established between the MITECO as CITES Management Authority and SEPRONA of the civil, the SEPRONA, that is the environmental, SEPRONA? I have to think of that in English. Well, the body that protects the environment that belongs to the civil guard, and they are the enforcement authority. Amongst these actions, we provide training for SEPRONA agents. We also provide logistic support for police interventions in which live animals and plants are expected to be found, and those animals are taken straight to CITES rescue centers. Since the TFS plans, there is also a high information exchange rate between MITECO and SEPRONA. And recently, we also developed joint investigations. And that logo on the left is the logo that we have created for the investigations created by this mixed analysis team integrated by people from the ministry and from SEPRONA. So as the result of this collaboration between SEPRONA and the Ministry of Environment for the Ecological Transition, we highlight that there has been a significant boost on police operations, and also us as management authority, now we develop better better targeted and precise expert opinions for the inclusion of for their inclusion in the police proceedings. And this way there are more police investigations that are successfully taken to the courts. Other results of the Plan TFIES is that there is now a higher contribution of science to investigations, and we have more controlled and more effective rescue centers. At the national level, we have focused on capacity building for environmental guards in countries of origin of this poaching and illegal logging. And we have focused on that because they are the first line against poaching. They are there on the ground. They see everything. They are our witnesses. And also because there is a very big lack of training amongst this collective. Even many of them are volunteers, so they don't get paid. So it is necessary to help them, because in the end they are helping us by protecting the environment. So in this sense, we have detected a hole. It is great that there is improvement in the commitment and progress in police investigations against environmental crime, but there is not enough there is not enough progress in the surveillance and protection on the ground. The conclusion is that more efforts at the EU and in general at the international level should be put into the training and improving the conditions, the working conditions of environmental guards. Where are we now regarding the TFIES plan? So we are now in a review and update process in order to incorporate the WAP novelties. We have already undergone a public participation process. We have already consulted the signatory ministries and also the collaborating entities. The response has been very positive. The draft document has been very well accepted, and the suggestions and additions that they have made have been mostly incorporated in the final text that will be shortly sent to the Council of Ministries for its approval. To end up, there is something we would like to highlight, and is that at least in this point, the TFIES plan will try to go a little bit beyond the WAP 2.0. And is that, of course, as the Wildlife Action Plan the Wildlife Action Plan, one of the measures is to increase the engagement of and the training to the judicial sector. We will do that as well, but we will also try to promote the creation of specialized environmental courts in Spain. As you know, specialized environmental courts will be able to assess adequately this type of serious crimes, and that they really deserve to have sentences that are proportionated and dissuasive for criminals, so that they don't continue doing this crime, because it's very attractive. It yields very big revenues, lots of money. The risk for the criminals being caught is very low, and the penalties are very low as well. So it is a circle that needs to be broken. And in breaking this circle, the specialized environmental courts will have a key role. And with this, we finish our presentation. Thank you very much.
I'll just speak from back here. It's easier. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Agata. We're a little behind, so we're going to go ahead to our first technical panel. But if you do have questions for either Agata or Diana, please jot them down or put them on your phone or remember them, and we'll try to have time later. I'm now very pleased to give the floor to Toby Park, who's the head of energy and sustainability at the Behavioral Insights team, who will moderate our first technical session on behavioral science to reduce consumption of wildlife products. Toby, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon all, thank you very much. So I may be the odd one out here in that I'm not steeped in wildlife conservation. My background is in behaviour change. I work a lot on net zero behaviours, so electric vehicle uptake, sustainable diets and so on. But I have had the pleasure of working with WCS for the last few years on some wildlife conservation work. But I think if we want to talk about, okay, how are we going to get this to work? Okay. I'll continue with the voiceover. But I think if we want to think about how we change consumer behavior with respect to wildlife products, we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions around what is it that drives behavior? What are the determining factors that shape our choices, the things that we do in the world? And you'll see a diagram in a moment, but I think there's a sort of conventional answer to that essentially looks a bit like what we call rational choice. So the world of classical economics tells us that we might have certain set of preferences, we have certain access to information and knowledge that will shape our intentions and that will lead to behavior. The psychological world has roughly the same theory, or at least it used to, but it talks more about values and attitudes and so on. Excellent. Thank you. Now, I'm not here to say that's necessarily wrong. Of course, it's important. Of course, wildlife consumption behavior is going to be deeply rooted in values, in people's attitudes, in their beliefs, and so on. But the point is, if you have just that model of behavior, then your efforts to change behavior will tend to lean towards trying to change people's beliefs. Maybe trying to educate people so they have different knowledge, perhaps trying to persuade people so that they change their attitudes and their values. And of course, that is important. But it's also very incomplete as a model of behavior. So, for example, it doesn't explain why, if you offer people a choice of coffee, and a small, a medium, and a large, most people will gravitate towards the medium. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small, the big's a bit too big, the medium is the size for me. But if you do this, and you introduce a new large and take away the original small, and you offer the new choice set, they tend to gravitate towards the new medium. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small, the big's a bit too big, the medium is the right size for me. So we overlay these sort of objective explanations onto our own behavior, but of course what's actually happening there is that we've altered people's behavior just by changing the way that the choice is structured. So if you wanted to increase demand for coffee, or indeed reduce demand for coffee, you might not think about persuasion or education, you might think about changing the way that the choice is presented. Likewise, the rational choice model doesn't explain how solar panels are literally contagious, in the sense that if more people around you install them, you're more likely to install them as well. That is not strictly down to people's attitudes in an objective sense. It also doesn't explain how we managed to cut food waste by around 45% in hotel canteens in the UAE by simply changing the default portion size. So people could ask for more, they could go back and take more, but by having a smaller portion of food on the plate to begin with, people wasted significantly less food. Again, in hindsight, it's an obvious solution, but it's one that is not rooted in changing people's attitudes and values. And finally, it also doesn't explain how we managed to have a greater impact at reducing human-wildlife conflict by giving out free barbed wire so that farmers could make these tiger-proof enclosures. Interesting. As opposed to educating, providing educational services, learning opportunities, and so on. If you give people free barbed wire and they have a time limit for using it, more farmers built their tiger-proof enclosures, whereas in the educational program, nobody did. So in other words, I just want to make the point that there are these sort of sideways views on changing behavior that are not rooted in that conventional rational choice model. And there's a whole science that focuses on this. It's been, I think, particularly prominent over the last couple of decades, but it's got roots that go back further than that. Some of you might have read or come across some of these popular science books, for example. But I think if you wanted to distill the lessons from this science maybe into two basic points, it might look something like this. So firstly, non-conscious processes of decision-making and behavior are more dominant than we tend to realize. So it's not just about knowledge, attitudes, and so on. It's also about things like our cognitive biases, what we call heuristics, which are like our sort of rules of thumb or mental shortcuts that we take. things like habit, which is often a response, an automatic response to cues in our social or our physical environment, for example. And one consequence of that is that the environmental impact on our behavior is a lot stronger than most people tend to expect. So the context, the way that choices are framed and presented to us, the way that social norms manifest in the environment around us, what choice happens by default if we just go with the flow and don't express a particularly proactive choice, for example. But that has some real impacts and implications for practitioners. So firstly, these more conventional methods of persuasion, as we talked about, so changing attitudes, changing beliefs, they're still valid, but they need to be done in smart ways so that we can also use those methods to target those more non-conscious processes. Secondly, behavior change interventions can and should go well beyond just communications and marketing, because as we've just seen, there are a lot of things we can do to nudge people's behavior by changing things like the default outcome, the incentives people face, how we can remove hassle and inconvenience from the right choice, and so on. And if the first two things are true, then the third is also true, which is to say that we also need to get really good at social and behavioral research, because of course it's a lot harder to understand and measure non-conscious processes of behavior change. It's a lot harder to expect people to just introspect and self-report about the environmental and contextual factors that are shaping their behavior. So you can't just go into a focus group and say, which of these two posters do you like the look of, and spend 2 hours talking about that, because not only is that a very unrealistic account of people's exposure to those campaigns in the real world, but it's also relying entirely on self-report and introspection on behalf of those people, and that can only tell you a limited amount about their actual behavior. So that's really the behavioral insights or the behavioral science approach. I think it brings three things really. Firstly, it's evidence-based. So it's largely based on cognitive and social psychology and behavioral economics, but more importantly, regardless of which discipline you have a particular interest in, it's about applying the scientific method to the way that we design interventions, campaigns, and measure their impact. It's intervention agnostic in that it's not just about social marketing, it's not just about communications. Those things can be done, and they can be done well or they can be done poorly, but it's also about incentives, regulation, nudges, changing the choice architecture, and so on. In essence, whatever the evidence suggests is driving the behavior is the thing that you should focus on rather than jumping to a particular approach. And it's not just evidence-based, but it's also evidence gathering and generating, in that we should always evaluate what we're doing so that we close that virtuous circle of using the best evidence and then updating our knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. So with all that said, that's a little bit about my background and I suppose our perspective on behavior change, but it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel if the four co-panelists would like to come up on stage. So we have Lishu Li, who is the China Director for Counter Wildlife Trafficking and the Temperate Asia Regional Coordinator for Counter Wildlife Trafficking from WCS. We have Lud Kinzonzi, who is a, please take a seat, yeah, who is a postgraduate at Oxford University in International Wildlife Conservation Practice. We have Sarah Ferguson, who is the Nature Crimes Convergence Lead at Traffic. And we have Ivana Murillo, who is the Program Manager for Counter Wildlife Trafficking in the Andes Amazon region from WCS as well. Part of a pop group with these four microphones, but so I guess there's sort of three topics, broadly speaking, that I thought we could talk about before opening this up to the room. One, firstly, just to get a bit of an introduction to the work you're doing, how you're thinking about behavioral science. We'll then maybe do a bit of a detour into some of the tools and methods that we think about using, and then we'll think a bit about, well, what are the answers, if indeed we have any, because this is still early days in the use of these techniques. What are the techniques we can use? I'm not sure your microphone. It's on this end. Okay, I'll get it close. Thank you. Okay, so Ishu, I'll start with you. We've been working together for a few years now in the China region. So I suppose you've been on a bit of a journey in terms of learning about and starting to use behavioral science in your work. So firstly, if maybe you could just introduce the work you're doing out there, the projects, and then reflect a bit on your experience of using behavioral science, what you've learned, why you think it's the right tool for the job.
Give her the microphone.
We have lots of microphones.
Yeah, easier. Thank you, Toby. It's such an honor on this panel. Like Toby said, for the past 3-4 years, BIT, WCS, and together with China's Sun Yat-sen University, a local university in Guangdong province, has been working on a project supported by European Commissions to against on the demand reduction using behavior science to address the demands on freshwater turtles as pets, tiger bones, and Asian elephant skins used in China. So far we are towards the end of the project, collecting data, etc. So the most things I learning from this whole project, whole process, because this whole project is more like a learning by doing process for us, is we so deeply realize that behavior is not an actions or a simple result at the one time, but it is a whole journey of action steps a person or the behavior holders have been through. Therefore, that like Toby showed in the presentation, give us more than a linear kind of process we can intervene, but provide us more than a network that you can choose which part you can touch on, and also depends on what kind of organization you are, what kind of stakeholder you are, you can choose the more feasible and impactful touch point that you can design interventions based on the evidence you collect through behavior science on it. Another thing I learned from it is we really need a good partnership to work on a successful BI project, because on one thing, as I described, there's many steps of a behavior have been through a journey. So therefore, we need to learn from it. For example, in our project practice, we need to interview lawyers, hobbies of pets, local community members, pharmacy people who sells different medicines, doctors, and also practitioners in all kinds. So those knowledge can help us who are the people interact with the targets audience that we are target on, and also to learn how they are interact and the power dynamic, etc. So therefore, a partnership can enable us to have the access and channels and resources to touch on them. So this is the major two things I really want to reflect from our project.
Thanks, Lucia. I mean, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think partnerships, as you say, are so important for so many reasons. It's not just about bringing in that local knowledge, that expertise from different disciplines and so on, but also, of course, if we're going to move towards more innovative behavior change interventions, as you say, often that requires some kind of novel channel to the target audience. And so you need to be working with others who have that access, have that touch point. Sarah, I want to move on to you. You've got quite an interesting background in that, as far as I understand it, you studied biology initially, but then you did an advanced degree in environmental law. Your past work has also worked on policy development, on the policy end of things. And now, of course, we're talking about behavioral science. So you've got the benefit of quite a broad perspective on these issues. So I'm curious to hear how you think all those sort of different disciplines and expertises need to weave together to solve these problems. And I guess in particular, what value add does behavioral science bring in that sort of ecosystem of disciplines?
Thank you. Hi, thanks. Maybe a closer one is. Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. But I think that combating wildlife trafficking is a multidisciplinary. It does require these multidisciplinary approaches if we're going to succeed. And so Traffic looks at well, in behavior change, we use what's called what we call a twin track approach, which means that we try and make sure that the laws are in place and that the laws are deterrent enough to actually dissuade the action in the first place. But then we also use the behavior change to shape the social norms. So we try and make sure that those things are working at the same time. But then when those things are working in parallel, then we also are working on, we are essentially limiting consumer choice. So then we also work on finding alternatives. And that's, I think, where my biology background can come in. And also, as you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that this is also essentially looking at economics. So then we want to be looking at finding alternatives, but then you also need to make sure that the alternatives are also sustainable and that they're not detrimental. Because, you know, and as an example, I used to be the director of Traffick's Vietnam office. And one of the things that came across my desk at one point was the idea of, you know, rhino horn is used as for demonstrating wealth. And so somebody said, well, what about giving out gold, like gold coins, or, you know, encouraging the use of gold coins with things like rhino horns and pangolin scales or pangolin pictures on them. And that can be for looking at wealth. But obviously gold, you know, I mean, that carries a whole other set of issues, because that has environmental issues, that has human rights issues. I mean, so, you know, you need to make sure that you are aware of what the alternatives can carry. You know, same things with if you're thinking about tourism, or, you know, it needs to be sustainable tourism alternatives. So for me, just including behavioral science to my sort of suite of experiences, it made a lot of sense. I think that, you know, an ideal scenario, you have all of these moving parts working together, but when you don't have, I mean, it's laws need to be implemented, and when laws aren't being implemented, you can have behavioral science or behavior change to fill the gaps. Or even when laws are being implemented, you know, behavioral science can help them to be moving smoothly. So yeah, to me, it just made a lot of sense.
Yeah, agreed. There's plenty of examples where there may be a law, but the population is not necessarily fully complying with that law, and so behavior change is still quite a critical complementary tool, I think, for that situation. I'm going to jump over to you, Lud, now, if I may. So you come from currently from a more academic context at Oxford University. So you're working, as I understand it, on bushmeat consumption in the Congo region. So I guess a sort of similar question to you. If you could tell us a little bit about that work, and in particular, how you feel that behavioral science is sort of contributing to your work there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Toby. As you mentioned, I am currently studying at the University of Oxford, and part of the research I'm working on as part of the course is looking at a behavioral intervention which was conducted in the city of Pointe-Noire in 2019. Pointe-Noire is in the Republic of Congo, and it was a campaign that was trying to reduce consumption of bushmeat using behavioral science or behavior change approaches. And one of the goals with this campaign was to develop a campaign model, and which we did. And currently, the same model has been taken into the development and implementation of other campaigns in bigger cities like Brazzaville, or still in the Republic of Congo, but also in Kinshasa, in DRC. And these are campaigns which are understanding the consumers that they are targeting, which understand their culture, their value, and campaigns which are using positive messages. And it is being framed in the context of Congolese cuisine instead of being kind of traditional conservation campaigns that we used to have in the past. Because one of the things we saw is that people tend to reject the kind of conservation messages which were being used in the country in the past, like where the messages will be telling people what they have to do. Will be messages like law enforcement, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't eat this, we shouldn't hunt this kind of species, and so on. And but with this campaign, as I'm saying, because behavior change also requires understanding the behavior, the culture of the people where the work is being implemented. So we really look at that that side of things and developed messages which can really influence the people because it understands them. And all this work is being implemented in a urban context where we have where people have lots of other priorities, like other issues, electricity, transport, and so on. So in this context, you see that it's very very challenging for people to prioritize something, like to prioritize. I mean, what I mean is that in the context of those other social issues that we have, it's very difficult for people to simply follow traditional messages which was there. So behavioral sciences, because it can propose a different way to reach people or to address the issue with the people. That's what I think makes it a good method for the job. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think that speaks nicely to the point that these interventions, these campaigns, they obviously need to be evidence-led, which is to say that we need a true understanding of the existing values of the communities we're trying to engage with, not sort of projecting our own values as conservationists onto those communities and expecting to be able to persuade them that way. And I'd love to get into that in a bit more detail later. But firstly, Ivana, to you. So you're working in the Amazon region. Could you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing there, and again, how behavioral science has sort of been brought into that work recently?
Okay, thank you, Toby. Well, I'm going to be very honest because yes, we are working on different actions related to combat wildlife trafficking. I don't know, more than 10, 12 years in our region. I'm from Peru. As you know that we have the Amazon, we have different biodiversity, many of the species that threat with different illegal activities for different uses like pets, ornament uses, medicine. We have different demand at local level and international level. Yes, we have different experience and knowledge about what's happening about this problem. As WCS, we develop different diagnostics to try to understand the problem. We have different rank of the different listed species that involve on this type of trade. But at the beginning, when we heard about the behavior change science or this type of initiative, we have not any idea about this, what's about that approach. But we decide to try to improve this new knowledge because at the beginning, as I mentioned, that yes, we know about the different species threat about under this problem, but okay, as part of our strategy, we understand that it's important to work with the people who are demand the different of these species. We decide to try to understand more than the list of the different species who are involved on this trade. We decide to include as part of our strategy to understand different motivations, to understand more than the biological aspects. 2 years ago, we just start learning because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have not any idea, and we are still learning. Nowadays we are implementing 2 pilots relate to 2 study cases, one in Brazil and second one in Ecuador. In Ecuador is related to pet trade. In Brazil is one study case related wild meat for related turtle meat consumption. But as I mentioned, that we are still learning because, okay, if you talk about pet trade, it could involve many species or different species, the kind of species in different places, and not only in cities. We need to identify which public are demanding this, which people are demanding this type of animals, what is their motivation, for what reason they would like to have wild animals as pets, and different other type of information that we need to understand more than only biological aspects. Yes, that's the example that I can mention now because we are in this process. As part of the process, we try to improve our knowledge about this topic, about this science. And yes, we have not yet any result to share in this moment with you, But the message that I try to disseminate is in these opportunities about our lesson learned that we obtained until now. But yes, for me, that's also a good opportunity to have a different strategy more than develop only or thinking about the comms campaigns or only to disseminate the message. It's important to know about how we are going to change the behavior as part of as a strong strategy to reduce the demand, and we are working on and learning, as I mentioned.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can I just do a time check? Are we looking to end at past back on the original schedule? Okay, great. We'll jump into audience Q&A in a second. Maybe I'll just ask you to keep this next one brief. I did just want to touch very briefly on methods and process, because I know that can be a bit dry sometimes, but I think to do this kind of behavior change work well, it does depend on being prepared to get into the weeds of, you know, getting really good at field work to understand what's driving existing behaviors, really good at survey design so you can get reliable data, good at running perhaps field experiments, etc. I'm happy for anyone to take on this question, but I guess in particular, Alicia, I'm aware that, you know, you've been focusing on some of these issues yourself recently, and I think, Lud, you've done some quite innovative work as well, using, for example, you know, online social media scraping and so on. So maybe just briefly, if you could share a bit of sort of insight as to what tools and methods you've been using.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of method, you mentioned it. Understanding the drivers of the consumption is very important. So at the beginning of our project, we conducted some qualitative and quantitative studies to understand first the drivers of bushmeat consumption in those cities where we are working. But we also did some consumption studies to understand the frequency of bushmeat consumption, but also what are the other available food or protein that people consume apart from bushmeat, just to look at how, like, what's the difference in what's the difference in terms of consumption of the different proteins which are available. And apart from that, it was also very important. One thing we did was conducting a lifestyle study using qualitative methods like focus group, because we are working into changing people's behavior. So it's very important to understand their lifestyle, like how do they identify themselves, what are their values, and which kind of media do they use. So to do that, we run some focus groups, which were very useful in terms of getting the information we needed to design those different campaigns I mentioned earlier. And maybe I can also mention that in terms of impact evaluation, which is key, which is very important to know what is working, what is not working, and how we can improve the work that we are doing. We conducted some, for Portnoy particularly, we conducted some before and after surveys to be able to look at what is the difference after the intervention. Did people understand the messages? How many people have we been able to reach, and so on. So that was like early, like I would say a few weeks before and after the campaign. But because as time goes on, many things happens, and those things can also influence the consumption. We thought it was good to go back on the field, talk to these people that we targeted, the consumers. So we went back like 3 years after the intervention, just to do a kind of midterm impact evaluation. And for this work, we used interviews with different stakeholders who are involved in the bushmeat sectors, including government actors, vendors, consumers, and many others. So I think those are the few methods that I can share, and which can be very useful in doing this kind of job, this kind of work.
Perfect, thank you. Did you want to add in? Yeah.
I also want to add it's not only like the methodology, but also like how you apply this methodology. The process contains a lot of technique as well that we learned. For example, when you form the survey, how to form the question. Like you need to keep your questions not a closed question. It should be open questions, and you should in interview, but also you need to ensure that your question don't have a presumption or influencing the answers because people tend to please others or they please the society. Therefore, we need to very carefully design that, and that also need a lot of consideration and thoughts, as well as I think it's very important to test all the methods in a small pilot scales in the different groups. For example, Luke mentioned about the focus group. We found that in some of our project, it's useful to get the information to explore the solutions. But in some occasion, for example, for our pet tray study on the freshwater turtle, because they're a group of hobbyists, so they tend to have their own opinions, strong opinions. So our focus group went a little bit disaster because there's one very spoken influential individual in that focus group. So I think this is all elements you need to learn from experience, learn from others, and also adapt to the situations where you can do. And another example I want to mention, when we are doing the elephant skin project, because the consumption market is in a very rural area, bordered at border area. Therefore, at the beginning, even though we want to use this tablet to increase the efficiencies of our input of data, but actually in the field work, it's not going to work because some of the target audience we talk to, they are elders, minor ethnic groups in that area. They cannot read Chinese, the simplified Chinese, and therefore we immediately adapt our methodology into like we hire local people to help us to read it in the local dialect to help them understand. But of course, when we do that, we also need to do training to ensure all the interviewers are not doing the influencing work on our interviewee. So I think all that, there are a lot nuances, details, important technique into this what we call science of behavior. So that's what I want to add.
And I completely agree. I think sometimes one-on-one interviews versus focus groups, or online versus telephone versus face-to-face, they can seem kind of interchangeable in that they can be used to answer the same set of research questions, but they are completely different in terms of the dynamic that you create between the researcher and the subject, and that can have quite a big impact on how people will open up about certain topics. Anyway, with that said, it'd be great to spend 12 or so minutes. I think we've got opening up to the audience, so I presume there's some roaming mics somewhere, or if people want to speak loudly, that's also fine. I think we'll take a couple at a time. So the first two hands I saw were the gentleman right against the wall over there and the lady in black at the back. We take two questions at a time, and then I'll open up. There's that gentleman at the end there.
Just talk into it. Should be.
Thank you very much, Oliver Fox, European Commission. Thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this event, and thanks very much for the insights from the panel. I have a question that's mainly directed to Mrs. Yobana Murillo, and it's about the cultural anchors that there are in a particular society. To what extent do you think they play a role? And I'm thinking about things like religion, worldview, spirituality, mythology. And if that's the case, to what extent does that affect the potential to use behavioral science to reduce consumption of wildlife products? And then also a related question, which is about to what extent can we work with children? You know, to what extent does education have a role to play? Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, and it is important question because maybe as you know that in countries as Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, countries who have a huge Amazon, we have a different culture as part of our life. This type of having these different animals, wild animals as pets, or consume different wild products. And it's important to consider this type of evaluation related culture. Am I going to mention an example, relate the case that we are implementing in Brazil, for example, because we identify a problem related that the consumption of wild meat from turtles. There is an activity promoted by the people who lives in the Amazon. They usually demand this type of meat relate of different special days. For example, in nativity, in Christmas, sorry, or other type of special dates. We have to include this type of criteria when we develop this the study and the season that we are going to collect information. On the other hand, different activities there are in our countries are legal and illegal. The consumption of this meat in Brazil, this wild meat from the turtles, in this specific area in Amazonas state is legal. But this meat is provided under breeding centers, but the culture demand on these special days is higher than the production that this type of breeding center have to produce to offer the quantity for this huge demand. And for that reason, we are trying to understand, okay, how do you need, or why is the reason that you really need consume this type of meat? We, at the beginning of the project, we start doing different research survey in the schools of this locality to try to understand also the different knowledge from the people who works on this place, and also to the children. We noticed that the people who try to consume more this type of meat is the adult, the leads of the different families. We try also to identify if the demand is more for men or for women. That is the important criteria that we are trying to also identify. But the first motivation that we also identify as part of our research was the culture act. The culture was very very important on this type of demand. Yes, we have this challenge applying this component or this initiative in our countries.
Who did you call on next?
On the corner of the back.
There you are.
And then the third hand I saw was somebody in the sort of middle here. I don't know who that was. This gentleman in the white shirt. So yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you, Toby, and all the panel for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. I have a question for Lud. So in the research for your target audience, did you find at all that their demand was driven by food security challenges or lack of alternative protein sources at all? And if so, how did that inform your interventions or your campaign?
Yeah, good. Thank you for your question. So what we found out on studying our audience is that they consume bushmeat as a luxury food. It's not really driven by a lack of other meat that they can buy. And here I want to note that we are working on urban areas. We are working on urban areas, and in urban areas, bushmeat is expensive compared to other meat. So it's really a prestigious consumption, and people consume for many different reasons. Like they say, it has the best taste. It is better for the health than eating other types of meat. Yeah, so which is different with rural areas, where there are also some other projects which are happening, but I'm not particularly involved on that. But in the rural areas, bushmeat is really important, and the fact that we are taking most of the meat which is hunted in those areas into the cities, it can constitute a food security threat for people in rural areas. That's why it's very important to reduce the demand in these urban areas where people have access to other domestic meat produced locally. Although I have to acknowledge that there is not a very big production of local protein or local meat, but when we go into the markets, you see goat meat, beef meat, you see it every day. So I think as our campaigns are going to bring their impact, we also need to look into how we can also kind of raise the availability of other proteins. But I think this is yeah. That's what I can say about it.
Thank you.
I see several hands. Who did you call on next?
Yeah, there was a gentleman in the white shirt that put his hand up earlier, and there's a few.
And then I'll call.
Yeah. Should we maybe take 3 questions at once, and then I'll
Okay.
And then we'll try and wrap it there. So go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Nacho Aransay from the Spanish Ministry of the Environment. And I wanted to ask something that has been asked before but has not been answered. How can, especially to you, Mr. Toby Park, how can you work with children in behavioral science? Is it possible at all? Thank you.
Okay, I'll have a think about that. In
Well-
the meantime, so there was 2 ladies' hands, one at the very back with a hand up down, yeah, and you there as well.
Hello. So it's not really a question, it's more a complement to the answer by Lud, because I'm working on another project also funded by the European Union, the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. And we're also developing behavior change campaigns, both in big cities. So for example, we're working in Brazzaville with the example that Lud gave, but we're also looking at much smaller towns closer to the forest, like Weso in northern Congo or Mombasa in DRC. And here, during the research, we found that actually availability or affordability of other alternative are either problem, either reason why people are consuming bushmeat. And then when you find that, then behavior change is not the way to go first, because there's a set of preconditions. If they're not met, people won't change because they just can't afford it. So in this country, in these places, we're working first to develop alternative sources of proteins, availability, and only then when they're available, that's when we can switch to nudge and behavior change. So behavior change is a big part, but it's not always the first answer to the problem.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Olga Kuzminok. I'm with UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And to sum up the behavioral, or let's just sum up the drivers of consumption, we clearly see 3. It's the livelihood, it's the health, and the luxury market. And my question to all panelists is, what has your experience been with these 3 categories during the COVID times? Because what we saw, because of the border controls, the consumption in health and, say, luxury-related markets went down. There was less availability in Asia, but the bushmeat consumption, for example, in Africa, especially when the revenue went down in the national parks, increased dramatically for the livelihoods. So I wanted to hear from you what your experience was and how can we learn from that, because that actually put back wildlife on the international agenda highly. And we, in a way, are having this conversation today in such a scale, I think, because of that crisis that shook things up again. But I'd be curious to hear about your experience. Thank you.
Great. Maybe while you have a think about that, I'm happy to briefly answer the question about working with children. So I think, there's no reason why you can't use behavioral science techniques and approaches working with children. Of course, there's always going to be an added level of ethical obligation to make sure that it's, fully informed, consent-based, and so on. But children, like all humans, are still, cognitively comparable, I think. So some of the same techniques that we've talked about, they're still going to be susceptible to social influence. They're still going to be driven by what's convenient, what's easy, and so on. There's also some added benefits potentially in that obviously children are still forming their values and attitudes. Habits can sustain through lifetime. So in some of my work, for example, in the sustainability space, we've looked at encouraging people to move out of private vehicle use towards more public transport, active travel, and so on. And obviously one of the best ways to do that is to target teenagers who haven't yet got a driving license, so you can instill those habits. Other colleagues of mine have worked more in schools, looking at things like educational attainment, where we've developed apps to encourage students, young students, to create study buddies, to sort of bring each other to account in terms of doing homework and provide support to each other. So we've essentially developed a product that makes that kind of behavior easier. So I think there's lots of things that you can do. There's nothing, I think, that unique about the behavioral dimensions when working with children. But as I say, there's obviously big ethical elements that need to be taken into account as well, and added opportunities, I think, given that youth tends to come with the opportunity to shape knowledge, values, and attitudes in a deeper way. But yeah, do you guys want to have the last word? Ludo, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, if you can just allow me to quickly add a small comment on working with the children. And I think here it's also about, because behavior change is about having a scientific approach, it's also about seeing like how is working with children going to help. In Central Africa or in Congo, where we are working, for example, we had a lot of discussions to whether we need to do some activities with the children. But after we conducted the research informed us that the main consumers were the men who are aged 35 and above, and also the women who are aged 18 to 34. And we thought, because the problem is really on these aged people, it's better to focus on them. But as Toby just said, it can also be possible to include children, as long as you can have a scientific justification. For example, if that is just an example I'm giving, if children can have a certain influence on the choice of food in the house, then it can be good to work, for example, with the children to put in them this motivation to ask for different food than bushmeat, for example. And parents are likely maybe to satisfy the children and so on. Just to add quickly about that.
Thank you. And I think we're at time, but can we just get a very quick
1
response
minute,
to that
yeah.
question? Does anyone want to say anything about COVID, luxury versus livelihood? Go for it.
I'm not directly address it, but I want to give another aspect about, I don't think behavior science can solve everything, but definitely it's a good way to see through some of the problem. For example, if you are seeing we are focusing on the consumer's behavior that we want to change, but actually when we are trying to understand how they form this behavior, actually you know that the consumer also subjects to the availability of transportation. So COVID cut off the international transportation, therefore it's not available. There's no opportunity for the consumption. So this is also part of the behavior. And also to understand that policies, the income, the economic size, and also religions or other social norms are also part of forming that behavior. I think behavior science is provide us a tool to see through what one individual's behavior are connected to how they connect to the different factors, and you can choose as you are what agencies or what organization. For example, NGOs is not directly changing the policy, but if you are a policymaker and you got the behavior insight from the project, and knowing that you are upstream, some of the policy change might be significantly change the behavior. Why not? You can take that responsibility, and as an NGO, maybe we can do some, but we can still on our role using the knowledge, the understanding of that behaviors and the factors to choose a touch point that we are doable, feasible, and we have a resource to touch on, and then we can create some change and we can collect evidence on that.
Amazing, thank you. Perfect note to end on. I completely agree. We would often do a behavioral analysis of a situation, but that might lead us to the conclusion that some kind of regulatory change is what's needed. So on that note, thank you so much to the panel. We're obviously around, so anyone that didn't get their questions answered, please come and chat to us, but thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. And I do want to thank Toby and Li Shu, Sarah, Giovanna, and Lud for a fascinating panel. And I hope we're going to take what I'm going to call a 10-minute coffee break that says 15 minutes on your schedule, but 15 becomes 20. So let's think of it, 10 minutes, start coming back to your seat. But keep in mind, behavioral science is not the magic bullet, but it is an important tool that we all need to use. Just putting up posters in airports, if we don't know who the consumers are and we don't know their behavior or motivations, it's just a waste of paper. So it's really important, and if you have questions, please get in touch with any of these panelists to really delve a little deeper into the whole issue of behavior science. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again to the previous speakers. Great discussion, and I heard a lot of great questions in the room. We heard about behavior science. We're now going to hear about crime science, and I'm going to turn it over to Scott Robertson, Executive Director of the WCS Counter Wildlife Trafficking Program, to introduce and moderate this exciting session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and welcome back, everybody. I hope you're enjoying your drinks and queuing. Right, I am not going to give this presentation, but I'd like to hand over to an amazing colleague, Dr. Julie Viollet, who is currently with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in their data team, who is going to give us a kind of a framing presentation to this next session. So please.
Thank you, Scott. So I'll start with a question that I think is fairly obvious, but I do think we need to state it. Why should we care about what works? And I'll make it very brief. It's why would you waste your time, your effort, your money, whether you're a donor, a practitioner, a researcher, a law enforcement officer? But the problem is it's not that simple because the evidence base for what works is still very much in its infancy for wildlife crime prevention. So what can you do to make the right choice? One, we can gather better evidence. And two, we can look at what has worked for other types of crime, because there is a body of literature and experience in crime science of what has worked for other crime types. I put up a picture of the SARA model here because this is one of the kind of ways of thinking that you want to use in terms of crime prevention. It's really looking at the problem and understanding it fully, then designing a response, then assessing that, and then going back and restarting the cycle over again to adjust and adapt. So what do we actually know about what works for wildlife crime prevention? Well, the answer is not that much. There's two systematic reviews of the evidence that have been done, Delpech and al., and another by Rytwinski and Muir. They essentially looked at all the interventions for terrestrial species for Delpech and al., and for the other looking at the species that U.S. Fish and Wildlife focuses on for Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And really what we're seeing is that even when projects are evaluated, the evaluation doesn't really give us enough evidence of impact and why you have that impact. The only exception, I had a bit of a flight of folly when I wrote robust at the top of that, we have some knowledge for patrols and some evaluations that are showing impact and showing kind of moderators of impact. So who's patrolling, the habitat type that you're patrolling in, all these things kind of moderate whether or not patrols are having an impact to prevent wildlife crime. But really what we're seeing is that the evaluations, they're just not strong enough at this point, or perhaps they're not done in the way that we need them to be done. There's still a lot of knowledge gaps for particular species, for particular regions, but also the evaluations, they're not using direct measures to evaluate success. They're using things like wildlife trade levels, number of seizures, which are really very, very indirect measures of whether you're having an impact. And a lot of the evaluations that we're doing, we are not using baseline data, where you're just looking at after your intervention, what are you seeing? And what you need for an evaluation is you need to know what it was before you intervene, then do the intervention, then after that evaluate with data from after the intervention. So what does crime science offer us? Crime science really offers us a way of thinking about how you design interventions. Because individuals who commit crime, they're reacting to an environment, they're reacting to opportunities. And when you're trying to design an intervention, that's what you should be thinking about in terms of how are individuals weighing the costs and benefits. We talked a little bit about rationality with our behavior change discussion. And I think the point is actors are rational to an extent. They're rational based on their own understanding of the world and the costs and benefits that they're weighing. And when you're designing an intervention, you need to understand that so the intervention actually affects what you need it to. And then also, crime science gives us a number of tools to think about how to design interventions. So things like crime scripting, which is really about going through the whole process of how you commit a crime and going through every action by every actor at every point so that you can understand, well, where is the best place for me to intervene? Do I do it at this point because obviously there's an actor here that's high level and therefore that's a better location? You have to understand all of that to be able to design an intervention that is the most likely to work. We also have tools to understand what locations are most risky, what wildlife products are most risky, but also we have frameworks of different types of interventions, because what we found with other types of crime is that you really need a combination of interventions that increase the effort for committing the crime, that decrease the rewards, that remove the excuses for committing crime. And you need all of those together to design the best interventions. I just wanted to put up there a few different articles showing the different types of ways that crime science, has looked at the problem of wildlife crime, including, a case study, for example, of how wildlife science was used to prevent leopard killings in Zambia. But what I will end with is that the new World Wildlife Crime Report is coming out in early 2024 from UNODC, and that we're going to have a chapter on what works in there. Obviously, like I said, the evidence is limited, but we want to give you an idea of what does exist and also what you need to do when designing interventions so that they're most likely to work. With that, I'll get it back to Scott.
Thank you for that, Julie. And I will also introduce the rest of our panel to join us up here. So we have Dr. Alexia Jonkier, who is he's a lead senior researcher with the National Institute of Criminalistics and Criminology of Belgium. If you could join us on the stage. And also, I can't see him in the room, but I know he's here, Dr. Daan van Oom, who's an associate professor of criminology within Utrecht University from the Netherlands. Thank you, Daan. Please join us up here. Great. So thank you all. We are going to have an more relaxed conversation. I know we've prepared questions, but I might go off script just to keep you on your toes. I thought Julie framed it really well then in thinking about how crime science helps us understand this issue of wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking more. Alexia and Daan, you're both coming as academics into the world of kind of practitioners. Maybe to start off, to tell us a bit about the research that you've been working on, what's brought you into studying wildlife crimes, why you're here. Daan, you're the furthest away. Would you like to kick us off?
Thank you for the introduction, Scott, and for being part of this amazing panel today. Well, I'm doing research for 10 years now on the illegal trade in wildlife, and I think what was important when I started my research is that there were a lot of questions unanswered. So, for example, the convergence between wildlife crime and other serious crimes, the role of organized crime networks involved in wildlife crime, but also how does it actually practically works on the ground. So what is the role of local people in relation to criminal networks, for example? But also a lot of questions about the modus operandi, the global scale, the global actors connected to all those local hubs. And I think, yeah, from my study background, criminology, it was really useful to use criminological approaches to look at wildlife crime, to have a better understanding, what do we actually see here? What kind of crime is this? How does it work? What kind of actors, organizations are involved in this science? And by using crime science, we use from that point of view, well, a lot of different models, looking at how to intervene, how to react, how to prevent, but also how to understand it. What is the role of families? What is the role of the social setting, peers, friends, cultures, economics, among a lot of other approaches? Because crime science uses actually a lot of academic disciplines by analyzing crimes: psychology, anthropology, economy, political science, etc. So you can imagine that all those different angles, micro, meso, macro level, all help to understand wildlife crime patterns.
Thank you. And you mentioned then, I think it's in some of the opening presentations, this issue of crime convergence, which I know you've looked into. Like, in your experience, what types of convergence have you seen as it relates to wildlife crimes and other forms of transnational organized crime?
Well, if we look at international, transnational wildlife crimes, we see that often it is not a crime on itself, but it's also related to other crimes in the area, to others, it convergence with other serious crimes sometimes. So from that point of view, what was for me an important lesson here is to, if you look at wildlife trafficking, do not look at wildlife trafficking alone. as something that is over there, but look at the environmental context. Look at the relationship with other problems or other issues in the area. Because without that, you cannot understand it and you cannot tackle it. Convergence happens in different parts of the world. I did, for example, research in Latin America, in Africa, but also in Asia. So you see some similarities, some overlaps. For example, when highly organized crime networks control a particular river, you can imagine that this river had this a specific example of Colombia, the Cacarica River, controlled by the Gulf Clan cartel. By controlling this river, they control the drug trade, mainly the coca trade, but also human smuggling going through this particular river, as well as the illegal trade in macaws and parrots. If we look at Eastern Congo, for example, when you look at the militia group controlling a particular forest, you see that they are in charge not only in relation to illegal mining, for example, or arms trafficking, but also in relation to ivory trafficking going through this particular territory. Or if we look at Southeast Asia and the role of Chinese organized crime, we see when they appear in a particular area and they are connected to methamphetamine trade, it can also well be the case that after a while they become interested in other illegal markets, including illegal wildlife trade, such as tiger bones or rhino horn. In other words, due to the high level of scarcity already introduced by my colleague, the low sentences, priorities, we see that crime groups diversify into illegal trade in wildlife, and therefore crime convergence in the local political economies is not strange at all.
Right, and I think it's, I mean, often, certainly from the NGO world, we use crime convergence as a means to try and get a government to take more action, right? It's like, this is why you should prioritize it, because it's not just wildlife, it's other issues as well. But do you, from what you're saying, like, it sounds like you can use crime convergence even to help in the design of your interventions or how you're thinking about crime prevention. Could you talk a bit more about that maybe?
Yes, of course. So if you think about crime convergence, you are looking at particular actors where crime converges, or you think about particular places, particular hubs, particular areas, particular rivers, mountains, etc. So it helps you to understand the crime process as such, and therefore also really important to understand how to react to it, where to intervene, how to prevent, for example, localized crime groups or local illegal entrepreneurs to be recruited for more organized crime networks in the local setting. So looking at convergence helps to understand the broader picture. And perhaps one thing to add, not only convergence with other crimes, other illegal activities, corruption, money laundering, drugs, weapons, but also how it converges with the legitimate world, how it converges with legitimate trade. How does this work? Think about laundering illegally obtained wildlife into legitimate products that arrive here in Europe.
Great, thank you. Do you want anything?
I think I would also just add is if you're seeing a convergence, you have identified a risk. Because obviously, if there's convergence, there's a reason for that convergence. Those criminal actors have decided to converge for a particular reason, be it a particular port that has less security or a particular area that they know that there is less risk. So I think convergence is a way to basically identify where you have a problem.
Great, thank you. Alexia, over to you, please. Talk a little bit about your research way and how you've come into this issue.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to speak about my research and the research of NICC. First of all, I would like to say that NICC is a public research center, part of the Department of Justice in Belgium. And with my colleagues of the criminology department, I do research in social science in support of criminal policy. And my colleagues in the criminalistics department do research in forensic science in support of the criminal investigations. So in criminology for some years now, we have been working on environmental crime, initially with our own funds. It was a priority for us because there was no scientific research in criminology on this topic in the French-speaking part of Belgium. And after a few years, a first project was subsidized by the Belgian science policy, and a second is underway with the Walloon region. Our focus is not what's happening abroad, but on what is happening in Belgium, namely on damages on wildlife in our country, including wildlife trafficking, with the aim of understanding environmental crime and the social and penal reaction, including the way in which the administration of justice operates. The first project was called Criminal Behavior Against Biodiversity, and we worked on cases of damage to biodiversity to try to determine in Belgium how the various protagonists react when environmental damage is identified. And the second project focuses on the workings of the Walloon administration, which is responsible for investigating, prosecuting, and punishing environmental and animal welfare offenses. This is a more collaborative form of research involving the implementation of scientific support designed to enable the administration to evaluate its own operations and the results of its repressive policies.
And so as part of that, you've been looking at specific kind of wildlife crime cases that the Belgian government's been dealing with?
Yes, of course. Our time with David Schee, one researcher, analyzed 50 cases of biodiversity damage in Belgium, and 3 of them provide us with some lessons about the trafficking of wild species in Belgium. 2 cases involving hunters and 1 case of poaching. So I would like to tell you more about those 3 cases. First, we analyzed a case in which 2 officers, one in charge of forestry management and the other a judicial police officer, were placed under criminal investigation because they were involved in the organization of illegal hunting parties and the illegal trade in meat derived from them. And above all, the regional administration denounced them for the breeding of muntjac deer to be released in the Belgian forests. What we have here is illegal trafficking aimed at introducing exotic species to vary the pleasures of hunting, disregarding all European legal norms and risks in terms of health, loss of native biodiversity, or safety. The muntjac causes road accidents. And what is interesting in this case is that the court discussions show the complicity and arrangement between public and private actors. The regional officers know the hunters well, and vice versa. Hunters are also the main lever for regulating and eradicating populations of exotic species in Belgium. You will understand that we are here dealing with a very special world in which the interests of the various protagonists are sometimes contradictory. The relationships have an impact as little as strong as the legal text. In fact, the hunting world in Belgium is a very, very small world. Another case study concerns a wealthy and influential big hunt organizer who was on the radar of an investigation unit specializing in hunting offenses. He is suspected of having inflated his quotas of deer killed in order to keep as many wild animals as possible on his property and to be the most attractive as possible. And despite the overwhelming evidence, the administrative sanction was a fine of 400 euros. This amount is derisory compared to the fortune of the hunter owner. Above all, the whole investigation revealed signs of collusion between the suspect and the authorities, reinforcing the image of hunting as a dominant lobby of highly influential people. And this case can be compared with a third and last case, the case of a woodcutter who, in order to make a little money in his free time, enjoyed the resources that the forest offered him. Sometimes he would shoot a wild boar and share it with his friend or family, and occasionally sell it at the local butcher shop. And this butcher was prosecuted for killing 2 wild boars at night. He received a suspended prison sentence. The analysis of these last 2 cases suggests a differential treatment of environmental offenses in Belgium. We can be influenced, for example, by the reputation of the offender or relations.
It's so refreshing to be talking about this issue, and we're not talking about a country from the global south. So it's great to hear that. I think they may be in the room, but I mean, is there any recommendations you'd have from your research to the Belgian authorities?
Okay.
They might not be in the room, but I don't know.
As work, as work is still in progress with the Walloon region, I can only make a few observations here, along with the researcher in charge of the project, Valentine Bayeux. She's here. First of all, I have to say that the legislation is in Belgium, but maybe in other land, is very, very complicated and not very well known, and varies from region to region. So in terms of prevention, we need to inform and educate about the importance of wildlife in Belgium as well as abroad, so that everyone can feel involved. And Belgium is a federal state, so when it comes to wildlife trafficking, a large number of public services are involved. Coordination action is essential if we in Belgium are to take effective action against wildlife trafficking. The training of these different services is also important. Not all police officers are specially trained in wildlife identification. We need more training in this area. Similarly, we need to be able to call on scientific expertise in the event of the seizure of wild animals, for example. We also need effective ways of protecting wild species. The authorities do not always know what to do with seized animals, where to find a suitable shelter, etc. It's also difficult to monitor what public services are doing because not everyone is used to reporting publicly on their operations. Or in terms of prevention, it's important to be able to see what control and repression public officers are doing and what sanction may be imposed. We also observe a bad situation in Belgium in terms of crime statistic. We don't have statistical data on wildlife trafficking to give us an overall view of the problem in the north and in the south of the country, and not just in terms of airport controls. Furthermore, not all cases are systematically recorded, and there are no coordinated and related databases on the work of the police, the public prosecutor's office, and the courts. This is a factor in explaining the lack of a global criminal policy on this problem. So this is why one of the priorities of the work we are doing with the Walloon region is to ensure that relabeled data is recorded on environmental damage. It will give us a better understanding of the scale of the problems in Belgium and enable us to analyze the response to the damages.
Thank you so much, and I'd encourage everybody to read some of the research that Alexia and her team are doing. I wanted to change tack a little bit. Julie, in your presentation, you were given some kind of a trailer, if you like, for what's coming up in the new World Wildlife Crime Report. But I think there's an opportunity, I think, for this partnership between crime science and kind of the practical implementation around helping it understand whether we are having impact or not. And you sort of alluded to it there, but what do you think, what are the impediments to us using crime science to do that are?
I think in some ways being able to connect the expertise with the people that need to know it. I think, you know, there's not a lot of necessarily crime scientists working on wildlife crime, and there's not a lot of crime scientists that necessarily working in the field with practitioners. So I think that's one of the things we definitely need to encourage that. I think also just a willingness in terms of discussions of failures, because crime science is all about learning from failures in some way. It's about, you know, designing an intervention. So looking at a problem, designing an intervention, but then figuring out whether or not it works with an evaluation. But when it doesn't work, it doesn't stop there. Then you go back and start over again. And you look again at where were the failures? Why were the failures? Did we not understand the problem well? And I think, you know, part of crime science is this discussion of failure, especially for criminologists. And I don't think we see that as much, at least for me, in wildlife crime. I think it's definitely donor related in terms of I wouldn't personally want to go to a donor and say, our intervention has failed, please give us more money. But actually you learn better from failures. You learn faster from failures. So I think that's definitely part of it as well.
Completely agree. I fail all the time, and I'm very happy to speak to that. Well, I mean, what do you think is needed, though, right? So that's definitely the situation we're in, but like, how do we improve that scenario?
improving our willingness to talk about failure?
Or just more generally, I mean, this kind of the impediment to understanding, are we having impact or not? I think you spoke about it a bit in there, like you know, you're seeing challenges as you're pulling together that report of that it's hard to even know whether we're having an impact. Like, what do you think are the things that what's needed to improve that?
Okay, well, first, a little bit going back to your question of how do you put crime science into some of this work. I think the one thing that crime science requires is time to understand the context. And I don't see a lot of donors giving that time in terms of money to basically sit there and not act. Because I think the instinct is to act immediately. When you apply for funds, you say, you know, oh, okay, you know, what are you going to do? Actually, the first step for crime science is, what is the problem? Did you analyze the problem? Did you understand the full contextual situation? And then once you have that, you actually design the intervention and propose it. But there's not as much money for that, obviously, because it's not action and we all want to act. So that would be one key component, I think.
That's a fantastic point. I think there's a small number, but hopefully a growing number of donors that are even like separating some of their funding, right? So they're saying, figure out the problem, then come back to us with how you're going to solve it. And I think we probably need more of that. I mean, Dan, I know you've done a lot of work on other types of transnational organized crime. Are there lessons we can learn from other forms of crime in terms of how that's been approached that we could take into wildlife trafficking?
Yeah, I think what is really important to have this global dimension. In our globalized world, a lot of those networks are actually connected, even though it may look like in, let's say, the rainforest of the Republic of the Congo, of the DRC, that or in Burma or in Laos, that we are talking about individual poachers that hunt a particular animal and are not connected to a particular network. But most of the time, when we are talking about high valued wildlife, it is connected to a particular network. It is connected to particular people that fund, for example, equipment, can be poaching equipment, can be loans, etc., etc. So from that point of view, for a very long time, looking at it from, for example, an ecological or biological approach, we see, okay, that the numbers are going down of a particular animal species, and we see that people are indeed involved. But to see the bigger picture, to see the interest of illegal entrepreneurs from Asia or from Latin America or from Europe in this context is really important, as a lot of the wildlife crime is a transnational crime. So to think of it in a transnational way is important, as well as the context, explained by my colleague already. Had socio-economic, geopolitical and ecological asymmetries between countries or regions actually result that crime groups will find new opportunities, will find new ways of dealing with new forms of crime. And this is the case for a lot of environmental crimes, including illegal trade in wildlife. So by looking at that, you can, to a certain extent, also predict what is going to happen, what is connected, what kind of local political economies are there already, for example, in relation to drugs or in relation to armed groups or in relation to, in Europe, in terms of economic decisions or upper and underworld interrelationships. So that is, I think, really important to keep that in mind. And in addition to that, we see in the last 10 years an increased interest to tackle wildlife crime on a global level. So what does that mean? That means for the near future that we will see that it will be criminalized to a certain extent, adopted in the penal codes. There will be more priorities, there will be more funds, etc., etc. So what does that actually mean for illegal wildlife trade as such? On the one hand, that can mean that, opportunists that are already involved, they consider it at the moment as a sort of gray area, and they will decide, well, we are not going to continue our business because we feel like this is a criminalized business. On the other hand, there will be new relationships between actors and new crime groups that appear in the field. Because if you criminalize something, that means that new methods to dodge law enforcement are needed. And most of those methods are quite sophisticated in already existing criminal networks, for example, involved in drugs or more organized crime networks. So a paradoxical effect maybe on the long term that we have to keep in mind is that by criminalizing wildlife trafficking on the long term will create new dynamics in relation to the criminal entities involved. Because as long as demand exists, as we already know, because of the former panel, the criminal networks will be there as well. So yeah, that are perhaps two advices from that point of view.
Thank you. And this, I mean, I've spoken to some of you about this before. Like, I find it's interesting that within the kind of the counter-wildlife trafficking world or in the broader conservation sector, we have really close partnerships with different types of psychological measures. But and I think there's so much to benefit. But like, apart from wonderful opportunities like this, where you're speaking to a group of practitioners and vice versa, what do we need to do to kind of integrate crime science with the practitioners more? And that's kind of open to all three of you.
I think one of the difficulties for me as a crime scientist is that I think some of the messages I have to give, I'm not sure that the conservation world is ready to hear. For example, there's very much in my feeling a push for enforcement and putting people in prison and increasing the penalties, etc. And for things like drugs, for example, we've seen that the war on drugs is actually hugely harmful and creates essentially a marginalized population of people that we've put in prison that perhaps would have been better deterred in different ways. And so I think that sometimes my difficulty is I don't feel like people are ready to hear that, because I do believe that conservation has jumped a little bit on the enforcement bandwagon. And, we do studies, for example, with UNODC in Southeast Asian countries where I talk with wildlife crime offenders. And I want to say to those countries, I applaud you for putting people in prison. I think that is a component that should happen for the high-level traffickers. But the people I'm interviewing, in some ways, they're not the ones that should be there. And we're missing out on really targeting the people that we should. And we're creating a generation of people that in some ways, when they get out of prison, are angry that they've been stigmatized, have no ties to their community, that have no resources to kind of restart their life. And all of a sudden you've pushed them into perhaps going back into criminal behavior. So yeah, that's one of the things those are difficult conversations to have. And sometimes there's no room for that.
Yes, I fully agree. So putting people behind bars is, of course, not the solution here. But we should, of course, make it a serious crime equally to other forms of crime. And that's already happening as we speak, how we look at environmental issues horizontally. So how we look at climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, etc., etc. So thinking about more eco-justice has solutions. So not only the role of the perpetrator, higher fines, etc., higher priorities, but also what's in there for nature. What's in there for all those species that are being trafficked is key in developing new regulatory frameworks, to develop new policies in a different world without anthropocentric values that are so extremely embedded at the moment. In addition to that, creating hubs, so knowledge hubs, is key. As criminologists and as crime science scholars, we are dealing with crimes each day, and we can share our experiences in this field from all those different dimensions, from a very micro level, psychological, or meso, what kind of crime groups, what peers, subcultures, but also on a macro level, what kind of state, how do states organize their way how to react to environmental crimes or to wildlife crimes, can really help to actively participate in developing new policies surrounding this. So sort of hubs that connects academics with policymakers or lawmakers or NGOs would be, I think, really valuable. Perhaps a small things to add here is also analyzing data, quantitative statistics, analyzing what we have, like confiscation data, but also legitimate trade statistics that can be indicators for new trends in illegal wildlife trade, if we discover irregularities, are so important to understand where we are going and how to react to this on the long term.
Excellent. Do you want to add something? Please do.
I would also add that one of the solutions as a crime scientist that I think is so key is also, I'm not sure whether we have the groundwork for that yet in conservation, and maybe it's my lack of knowledge. It's this idea that actually you can have as much enforcement as you want, but the people that stay on the ground long term are the community members. And so they are your eyes on the ground. And those are really the guardians. And I think there is some discussion of that in conservation, but I realize that when we have this very strong enforcement discussion as well, you're pushing the people in those communities sometimes that could become your guardians into kind of a backlash reaction sometimes, and they become less willing to be guardians. And so I think having that kind of discussion around, you know, how much do we use local communities to be part of the guardianship, because obviously those people are also some of the problem. You know, they're the hunters as well. So you have to find a way to have that discussion of where is that balance between involving the community, which has huge potential in terms of observation, in terms of convincing each other not to do something, and at the same time balance that with proper enforcement.
Okay, we're about to go to questions in the room, but before I wanted to remind anybody who's watching online that you can use the Slido app link, something, magic Slido machine, to submit a question and vote for questions. So please go ahead and do that, and we will take some questions in the room while Arno plays with that magic machine. Any questions for our wonderful panel? I think Sue's just coming to get you a microphone.
Yeah. And I failed in the last session to ask people to identify themselves when they ask a question, but I will succeed in reminding you now.
Thank you. And I was already intending to present myself. So I'm Miet van Looy. I'm the head of the CITES Management Authority in Belgium. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to compliment the comments made by Ms. Jonkeren. Because I think the study that you undertook looked mainly at, or perhaps only at, the regional level. Because part of your recommendation was, and at some point I saw some frowning eyes looking at me like, what are you guys doing? And so I just wanted to mention that at least at the federal level, when we look at CITES and the implementation of CITES in Belgium, we have all the reporting that we need to do. We have our yearly illegal trade reports. We do our training for the judiciary system, and it's working really well because we see that we have more good outcomes, legal outcomes, which is something that we will continue to invest in. It's also part of the Wildlife Action Plan. I do agree with your statement that Belgium is a very complex country, but that's unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, up to the politicians to decide how we organize ourselves. But I just wanted to bring a bit of a nuance there, because you kind of said like there's a lack of data, there's a lack of reporting, etc. So whereas at the regional level that may be the case, but at least at the federal level, it's not like we're not taking action. We try to do so, and we will definitely, with the new Wildlife Action Plan, try to intensify even more. We're very happy with the action plan, and we're looking forward to all the future actions that we can do. Thank you.
Who had their hand up next? Yeah.
Well, Dan, no, I were at the east of the DRC, okay, it's in Congo. Then, well, as you say, sometimes the wildlife trafficking is not the problem, it's a consequence, no, of many other things, no. Then, where I work, for example, no, there is a political instability in the region, okay, that has created a human conflict very long after the 1994 with the problem in Rwanda, okay. Then, well, this situation, this instability have moved many people between the countries, okay. Then the people need energy, okay. Then the ones that before were fighting because the the ethnias, now they occupy the national park, okay, like Cauci Vieja National Park or Virunga National Park, because they control the trade of charcoal, okay? But at the same time, in Cauci Vieja National Park, there is a lot of minerals, a lot of golds, a lot of coltan, a lot of cassiterite, okay? Then you know that most of the trade of mineral at days of DRC is illegal, okay? Then it's true that the wildlife, the chimpanzees, illegal trafficking of chimpanzees was not the first goal. But now, after many years, there is networks created in the country. And this network sometimes are support for people in the governmental institution, no? Then, well, I totally agree with the crime science is the point, no? To know in deep what is really happening. Because at the end, I am working in a rescue center, mostly for chimpanzees, and we try to support, okay, the sales of animal, and we try to support people that rescue animals, no? But it's very complicated. It's very complicated because there is many other things there. Then the problem is not just law enforcement, okay? There is a political issue, and there is the government in Europe that need to take decisions, okay? Because sometimes traffic is not an issue of many people. There is some people that are controlling trafficking in DRC, okay? But we see how these people can walk around Europe or United States without any sanction, providing at the end the funds that we are giving to them to combat wildlife trafficking. Then we need to see how we're going to continue to support this situation, okay? Because even if Europe going to invest many money to combat wildlife trafficking, nothing going to happen. Because we are looking, we see the people that is involved and we do nothing. And when I say political decision, I say to do sanctions to the country or to a specific person in the country, okay? Then, well, at the end, we can talk here many things, but we need to be less softer. We need to be harder in the decision, and the governments need to push more if we want to save this African rainforest.
Thank you. Do you want to respond? Please, Dan.
Thank you so much. And this indeed exactly illustrates how important the geopolitical and socio-economic context of such violent landscapes are to understand the illegal economies there. In particular, how people socially construct what is legal or illegal is, of course, a contested concept from that point of view. If we're talking about charcoal from the park, where not only local entrepreneurs or militia groups are involved, but as well the army or individuals of the army or individuals of the national park as such. So you can imagine how local people look at charcoal business from that point of view. And perhaps to add there also the social construction of charcoal as something for elites, high quality for cooking. So if you invite somebody in, let's say, a village, and you would like to be a respected inviter for having a wonderful dinner, you are not going to cook on charcoal from captive bred eucalyptus trees that were reintroduced by conservation programs. No, you would like to have the real charcoal from the forest because it burns longer, the food is better, and it's from that point of view socially and culturally be considered as high quality. And that kind of things are extremely important. Geopolitical, socio-economic context, as well as the social construction regarding illegal trade, in this case charcoal trade, how do they consider what they are actually doing? And if they do not consider it as illegal anymore, because everybody is doing it, what does that actually mean?
I'm going to hand the mic to someone, but take advantage of having the microphone and agree that the importing countries as well and the donor countries need to be tougher. I mean, 25 years ago, I sat in a meeting with the World Bank. I won't say which country we were talking about, and they said to me, but what should we do about the corruption in country X and wildlife trafficking? And I said, stop funding them. Stop giving them millions of dollars and stop importing their wildlife. I hasten to say that's not what happened. So I think, and that the corruption continues, and I won't say which country because, you know, there's more than one answer in this multiple choice here, but it is important. This is not only a solution in the range countries, it's also solutions in donor countries and importing countries. And you had a question. Sorry, I had to.
Hello, I need to introduce myself first. Okay, my name is Siu. I'm a student here in the Université Libre de Bruxelles. I'm doing a master with my research with Ifremer in French Guyana. So I just have a question about using trade statistics in combating wildlife crime, as Dan mentioned. So I'm just wondering if there is an example of how these trade statistics are successful in solving patterns in wildlife crimes and allowing intervention, because from what I know, like these trade statistics, they are mostly self-reported by traders to the customs. So there's a lot of underreporting or even misreporting. For example, in Hong Kong, we have found cases of where like fish malls fish mall reportings are actually dried abalones, or actually for the import of like reef fishes from Southeast Asia, the volume is just like 1/4 underreported. So I'm just wondering, like, how can we use these trade statistics effectively to like solve problems of like wildlife crime? And also, can I add a second question? Am I allowed to? Am I allowed? Okay. Yes, I just have the microphone. So I'm just wondering, how do we define if something is like illegal, as if like an activity is illegal, if like in the beginning there were like no laws defining it and people just started doing it, and then like it became very harmful to the environment, and like would just defining something illegal to start with be already marginalizing the group of people doing it, as Julie mentioned, that like putting people behind bars actually really like marginalize them and like turn them away rather than like allowing them to work with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take either of those questions? Or do you want to think about it and ask another question?
Yeah, I can answer quickly to the strength statistics.
Okay.
You know, I think it's difficult because a lot of statistics that you get, they come late usually, right? They come after something has happened. But I think what you can do is use a kind of combination of trade statistics and some qualitative data to understand. You look at the trade flows, obviously, with, for example, the seizure data to see, you know, which countries have seized the most items, et cetera, of a type of particular species. You can see some of the shifts in terms of, okay, at one point you saw a particular country was seizing a lot of this, let's say, you know, rosewood, but then it shifted to another country. That's useful because, one, you've obviously seen a shift, but you can try to see the differences between those two countries and maybe a change in regulation from one to the other, et cetera, and see the causal reasons why there have been these shifts. So I think it's useful for that. But I think a lot of times where you get good new information in terms of what happens next potentially is where you add that in qualitative component. So if you go on the ground and you find out that one country is seeing less rosewood being seized, but then you talk to the people on the ground and they're saying, okay, well, we've got a different type of species that's actually being extracted. So I think that combination is really important. I don't know about the other question.
Yes, definitely. Perhaps, so you always need a sort of qualitative, in-depth research in addition to your quantitative analysis, I would say, to have a better understanding of the context of it. But two practical examples, well, look, because of the illegal interfaces, looking at legitimate statistics from CITES, for example, and you can see some irregularities there. For example, that a particular country exports each year a particular number of captive breds, of wild species, and then at a certain moment we see that the 100 captive breds, 100 wild species become 100 captive bred species. So then there were some studies taking into account that it was a sort of transformation, a reflection of laundering there, that illegal trade was actually laundered, being added the value of captive bred rather than wild. So in reality, it was a sort of laundering mechanism. Another example is, of course, confiscation data gives you a lot of information. On the one hand, where is something coming from? Is this an origin country, yes or no? Where, for example, pangolin scales are coming from? Or is it from Germany and then enters the Netherlands? Why is it going through Germany? Are there particular actors there, etc.? But yeah, so I think confiscation data offers you a lot of data, but of course, be critical, because it's only a reflection, most of the time, of enforcement. Because most of illegal wildlife seizures are based on coincidence rather than effective controls. So yeah, keep that in mind. And of course, iconic species as well play a role here. Particular species that are under, particular species that do not have the targets of enforcement, etc. But said that, the data is there and can be analyzed, which is important, of course.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. My name is Theodore Treffon, Royal Museum for Central Africa, occasional consultant to the Wildlife Conservation Society. So Scott asked the question to the panel about how to create better synergies between crime science and practitioners. And it seemed to me that one of the obvious answers wasn't given. And it seems to me that improving mentoring of young experts in the field is something that's really a gap that needs to be reinforced. And I was wondering what the panel thinks about and what kind of strategies they do think could be useful for mentoring experts from government agencies, NGOs, local associations, local communities, because that's the link that's missing. If you don't have the engagement of people throughout the communities where we're working, you're not going to be able to bridge this gap between practitioners and crime science. So what's your feeling on that?
I mean, I think the problem for me is I would be more than willing to do that, but the entity has to commit to then using that person for crime prevention and really giving them the space, like the analysis that they need to do to find crime prevention solutions is almost it's a full-time job. And there's not a lot of organizations that have dedicated analysts for crime prevention. So I think I'm more than willing to, but the question is, do we have the commitment to then use those people for that purpose? That's difficult. I don't know the answer. Yeah.
We've got to wrap up, I've been told.
Yes.
To anybody who managed to use Slido, tough luck. Listen, I just wanted to say...
No, go ahead, wrap it up, yeah.
They figured it out. I just wanted to thank the panel. It's been fantastic to have you here. I would encourage anybody who's a practitioner who's never spoken to a crime scientist to come and speak to a crime scientist. There are also other crime scientists in the room. So, but from WCS's standpoint, just to remove my moderator's hat, I think there's so much to be gained from our kind of the practical sector to be working more with the academic sector on this issue, like it is in terms of how we understand the problem, in terms of how we design our interventions. And critically, I think the thing that most of us as NGOs are most interested in is of having an impact and actually being able to demonstrate and show that we have had an impact and we have changed and reduced the threat of trafficking to the species and the places that we are trying to protect. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope that next time, to go to that last question, that we do have more crime scientists coming, from the places that we're working. And I think we will do. I think there's a trend starting here that you're all part of. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to you, Sue.
Yeah, thank you. I don't want anyone to leave concluding that WCS says nobody should be put in prison for wildlife crime. We're just saying the right people need to be put in prison for wildlife crime. It needs to be a real deterrent in terms of risk, and not just put the people who might have been taking something in their luggage in prison and leaving the real traffickers with a €400 fine. I'm going to call on for our last technical session, Hani Cueva Beteta. Where's Hani? There you are. Hi, I didn't see you. The head of the Global Program on Crimes that Affect the Environment in UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Thank you, Hani. We'll introduce the session and then our speaker and panelists. Thank you. Should I invite the panelists or? Okay, you introduce Jonathan. Right? Oh, yes. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, let's see. It's on?
Yeah.
Great. So for our session, we will start with a quick, brief presentation by Jonathan, and then we will move on to a panel discussion. So instead of lingering on that, on my intro, I think we can pass on to the presentation by Jonathan. For those who don't know him, he is the program coordinator of the Wildlife Crime Leadership Initiative at the at WCS. So, thank you.
WCS, the appropriate name for the job.
I know, ironic. It's a super ironic name. My parents should have known better. Right.
I know. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, is that going to work? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Hunter. Since 2014, I've been supporting the Wildlife Conservation Society to prevent wildlife crime, mostly in Southeast Asia. Before that, I was a police officer in the UK. We've been reflecting a lot, haven't we? We know, despite our best efforts and lots of successes, illegal wildlife trade continues to be a real significant threat. Species continue to decline. It's not that we're kind of bad at what we're doing, it's just that offenders evolve, right? But our responses are typically lag, years behind often. So, I want to share some reflections on capacity building, and as well as one way we could respond to those reflections. We have the panel discussion following this, and I'm interested to see. I think some of you would disagree with these reflections. Some of you may agree but come to different conclusions, and that's great. And I think a real kind of concept we want to be generating in this sector is this: reflect, learn what works, do something, and then repeat that process. And I think that's something we really want to take away from this. So since between 2017 and 2019, WCS were evaluating our own capacity building work. And we concluded that there are several ways that we can improve. And one key shift, it requires us to separate two important but different types of capacity building. Short-term tactical skills training, for example, investigation training, is vital. But we found through our evaluations, it actually rarely reduces wildlife crime directly. It usually, as we've been discussing, leads to maybe improved arrests, improved prosecutions. And our hope is by putting more of the right people in prison, wildlife crime would reduce. But as we've been discussing, it isn't that simple, not always. Also, frontline officers actually find it difficult to implement the new skills they've been taught because they may face systemic or institutional challenges that it's not their responsibility to deal with. So we're not saying we don't do that type of training, but there is another type of capacity building. And that's really to think about the kind of strategic side of that. And that can really help law enforcement agencies and other organizations to prevent wildlife crime at scale and in a sustainable way.
And so since 2019, this is a response I want to talk about and get some thoughts on later. WCS have been developing a wildlife crime leadership initiative, and this really focuses on leaders with decision-making authority. It draws heavily on the crime science kind of approaches there, the strategic element. And we've been running it out in Indonesia and Vietnam for about 2 years. And the crucial thing is it's designed and delivered by the law enforcement academies in those countries. And WCS, or technical international subject matter experts, just provide that technical input. So that national ownership has actually led to the adoption of this program within countries like Indonesia. And so far, from our 2022 cohort, 40% of the officers have already been promoted following the completion of the program. So thinking back to our reflections, one key thing about this approach is trying to increase and diversify engagement to try and build capacity beyond just content delivery. So, using a blended approach of digital and in-person training, this type of approach that we're using in WCLI offers many times as much engagement as a traditional short course. But it isn't just about quantity. Adult learning principles really talk about the value, or any learning principle really, the value of feedback. If you think to yourself of anything you've ever learned, you probably had someone telling you when you went wrong. We need that feedback. So we use a supported learning model that really provides numerous forms of feedback, including coaching from other officers and mentoring from senior officers. Now, there are some prospectuses if anyone's interested at the back. I've put them on the tables. I know you can't read that. I'm sorry. But this global curriculum can be drawn on by the national trainers, and they can shape their curriculum into their own what they need. I mean, this program would take about 2 years if you went through all the content in a part-time study. So actually, it's adjusted and adapted. So as we explored earlier, this evaluation piece is critical. I'm really haunted by that question. Maybe in 5 years' time, we'll be talking about this, saying, well, that didn't work. Or maybe it did work, but we won't know why. And so it's a real theme running through all the sessions today about this, understanding what we're doing. So we're trying to track in 4 areas in this particular project, and drawing on models like the Kirkpatrick's evaluation model of learning, really trying to think about the inputs and outputs, to really trying to understand. And I think if we can combine this crime science approaches with this really rigorous monitoring of capacity building, we should actually be able to really impact wildlife crime in a much stronger way. But we are still learning. So I just wanted to present this as one response to those reflections, and I really look forward to hearing ideas, and you'll hear from some other amazing people in the panel coming up. So thank you for your time, and I'll hand over to Hani.
Yeah, please join our panel. So I would also like to start inviting the rest of our panelists to join us. Jonathan is already here. So Ben Jans van Rensburg, whose name is difficult to pronounce always. He's the Chief of the Enforcement Unit at CITES. Thank you, Ben, for joining us today. Mary Rice, Executive Director of Environmental Investigation Agency. Thank you so much, Mary. And Carlos Toledo Zapatero, Major from CEPRONA, if I understood correctly, Environment Protection Service of the Spanish Guardia Civil. And before I come here to moderate, I just I'm going to give you a quick preview of some of the things that I would like to bring up, both for the audience and for the panel, which includes we're talking about the impact effectiveness of capacity building. And also we need to start talking about sustainability. And in that context, what is the audience? Are we talking persons or institutions? Are we talking national, regional, subnational? How do we differentiate, or what is it similar and what is it different to work with law enforcement and criminal justice officers? What are good examples of this? And more importantly, we are always talking about innovation and technology, and that is good. But how do we include this in capacity building in a way that is also affordable? Because if it's not affordable, it's absolutely of no use for more than half of the world. So how do we work on that as well? And we will also try and touch on coherence, coordination, and the different actors that work on this area. So let me just pass there, and I'll. Okay, so so is it working now? Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I thought we will start first with the first one that we've already been talking about, which is um, what are good successful examples of capacity building? What should we have in mind when engaging in capacity building to make sure that those results exist and that they are sustainable? And any examples that we may have. So maybe Ben, shall I give you the floor on this?
Thank you, Annie. And I think we heard it in a few other sessions also, so it's not rocket science. We had on in the behavioral change session, you need evidence before you start working. We just heard now in the previous session, you need to understand the problem before you start implementing the solution. And I think it's not different for capacity building either. For capacity building to be effective and to have lasting results, it must be evidence-based. You must first understand what you want to fix before you can fix it. In some countries where capacity is good and higher than others, your ad hoc type of interventions can work well, where there's a specific need for training on combating illicit flows from wildlife crime or conducting controlled deliveries. But if you get to countries where there's really a significant need, where capacity is very low, where there aren't a lot of resources, you need a plan. And for that plan to be created, you need to do a systematic and an in-depth assessment of the needs in that country. And that's essential to achieve results. Through IQWIC, for example, the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, if you're not familiar with it, I see there's a nice poster there. It's a collaborative partnership between 5 agencies, the CITES Secretariat, Interpol, UNODC, the World Bank, and the World Customs Organization. And through that consortium, we, for example, developed prominent tools like a IQWIC indicator framework and the IQWIC toolkit that allows you to do these in-depth assessments. And I think if you really want impact, it's important to, at the end of the day, galvanize actions against the results of those assessments to make sure everyone contributes to the same goal and focus on the same issues where it's needed.
Thanks so much, Ben. And maybe Carlos, I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about examples and impactful capacity building in your experience.
Thank you, Hani. First of all, I would like to be patient with me because English is not my nature tongue and it's not my language of working, so I will try my best. I have some notes here, not to miss anything that I have in mind that it probably would be useful for every one of us, and we could share sharing my experience on this area. First of all, I would like to give you my framework. I'm a law enforcement officer, as Hani has already said, and in my core there's a branch, a specialty called SEPRONA, which Diana has mentioned in his presentation. This is 100% dedicated to law enforcement, of course, and wildlife protection and investigation. This about not 1,700 people working in SEPRONA, so it's a big amount of people out of 80,000 people working in Guardia Civil. So to enter SEPRONA, it's necessary to pass a course, a specific course that, and you have to to pass an exam to enter the course. No one in Guardia Civil that hasn't passed this course is able to be attached, to be able to be posted to Seprona. So it's very important to highlight that we have a specific formation to these people, right? After that, we have a continuous program, a continuous formation program related to give them more capabilities and refresh this knowledge that is enriched with his own daily working base. And it's in this moment that we give other actors to interact with us in these courses. Of course, we do courses that I will talk later about this related to CITES-related crimes, OSINT, good identification, ABOR identification, economic investigation, and sometimes, as I said before, we need to introduce other actors that are also involved in wildlife protection to be part of this formation. How do we select these people? We first need to address the people who need this formation, and of course we have to customize this program for them, because not every actor has the same needs. We do a multidisciplinary approach because we believe that training must have a multidisciplinary involved. We have to involve experts in many branches, outside the Guardia Civil, in order to enrich this formation, so as biology, conservation, environmental law, and other law enforcement officers that probably are not at the same level as us, but outside Spain probably they have more problems, difficulties that we don't face in Spain, but this point of view enriches our daily job. In summary, we do think that providing this necessary knowledge and procedures to all the actors involved at the first line of defense against the illicit traffic of species and other crimes related to environmental. Only in this way will be provided with the necessary legal security in the actions they carry out. A good example of it is that into Guardia Civil we have a branch called Customs, and in illegal trafficking, European illegal trafficking, we have provided them the information, the intelligence, the tools to identify this illegal trade, because this illegal trade is mainly made by airports and ports, so that in European Operation Lake, if you don't know it, is impulsed by Europol and tries to coordinate the efforts of very different law enforcement corps in this regard. This year was outstanding. The whole Europe had outstanding results, but in Spain we have very, very good results because of this formation we have provided this border police we have in Guardia Civil, and that's it, because we have focused this formation to them, and it at the end of the day give us very good numbers.
Thank you so much. So we're talking about customization, but also a professionalization, a professionalized approach that equalizes with a test in this case or in other ways. And then we move on to a more custom approach, depending on the types of crimes that they're looking at. So the reason I'm wrapping up is because Ben was also talking about more the institutional needs. Through a process of assessment. So my next question is basically looking at these two elements, the institutionals, and the need to understand the needs and the customization required. So Mary, I was hoping you can tell us a bit more about, how can we know what type of capacity building is required for preventing wildlife trafficking?
Okay, is this working? Okay. I think, so there are many points of intervention where capacity building might be needed. And sometimes it's quite simple to see where there is capacity needed. For example, if you see an emerging hotspot of illegal trade, you in a region or a country, you can assume quite, you know, that place needs a lot of capacity, and you can design and approach that at different points of intervention. In terms of what capacity is needed, for example, the way the EIA works, we look at perhaps where the gaps are, where the problem is, why is the problem there. Needs assessment is really, really important. And often there is a difference between what an institution thinks it needs to what actually the practitioners themselves think they need. So, you know, we frequently will talk to the institution, and the institution will say, you need this, this, and this. But then what we will then do is we will, once we've identified participants, for example, in any capacity building exercise, is send them a needs assessment for themselves and ask them where they feel the gaps are, where they feel they're, you know, they need more help. And it's quite surprising how different that is. And then what you're then able to do is design things around that. In terms of where there have been huge amounts of training and capacity building in certain countries or regions that are still not being successful, you then have to do a much greater analysis on what's not working and try then and drill down into that. And maybe it's identifying analytical needs. People, they need more analysis to sort of join the gaps between, you know, what the scientists are doing and what the practitioners are doing. And that's where your data becomes quite important. And so, yeah, I would leave that there for now.
Thank you so much. Yes, please jump in, Jonathan.
Yeah, I really like that answer, Mary. And I also really like Ben's point about evidence. And I think that there's a risk, and Mary made a great point about the assumptions. And I think we are very vulnerable in this sector to making assumptions because of what we think is working. And we've discussed it a lot here, but I think often if you speak even to the practitioners, often they might say, well, what I need is some new technology. You know, like I want to try this thing that's going to increase my ability to operate. But when you run through that theory of change, as we've just been discussing, actually what they're focusing on perhaps is, you know, increasing detection, increasing arrest, increasing prosecution. So if we were having this conversation a few years ago, I think that would have been the only tool in our toolkit. It would have been that assumption that, look, all we've got to do is arrest more people, and all of our capacity needs would have been angled around just, you know, putting more people into prison. That is how that's how I was raised in the police. So I think, you know, as we've been discussing here, and Scott concluded it in that session, that integration with the scientists and that evidence base, like Ben was talking about, saying, well, actually, you might not realize, but actually you're very, you know, to our practitioners and law enforcement practitioners, you're in a very powerful situation. You've got a really expansive toolkit. Your convening power to bring partners like all the organizations in this room to come to your table as a law enforcement leader and find a solution. There's few other agencies in most systems that can do that. And I'm always haunted by, you know, the UK policing is only really about 200 years old, with, you know, Sir Robert Peel in the mid 1800s, and his Peelian principles is all about crime prevention. And if you look at Vietnam's policy legislation on crime is also first line, prevent crime. And so I think that's one of the things we can do, is by having, you know, this connection with crime science and building this evidence base of what works to prevent the crime. And that's the thing that capacity building can really focus on. And as Sue made the point, it's still going to involve putting people in prison, but it's a more expansive toolkit about using the right tool for the right purpose. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. So we're recalling back the need to have evidence, for sure. And also the fact that we do need to match that evidence with a needs assessment that is not an assumption, but rather, you know, a distillation of a process of identification that, you know, has some data there. And I do like very much how Mary put it, which is there is a huge difference between what the institution thinks they need and what the practitioners will tell us they need. it's interesting also to talk about the convening power, because it brings us to the next question, which is, so let's assume that we're working on with all these elements. So how do we know which one is our target audience? How do we know who to reach? How to deliver the right capacity at the right level? And also, how do we deal with high rotation of personnel sometimes, or high rotation of leaders? So maybe Ben, can I give you?
Thank you, Annie. I think in terms of who do we engage, it's clear that you need to engage the entire criminal justice system. You cannot leave anyone out, because, as they say, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So unless you make sure from where the crime happens up to where the person gets convicted, the process runs well, it's not going to work. So you must work from your wildlife authority to your police, to your customs, to your judiciary. All of them must be included in the capacity building effort. The needs may vary and the approaches may vary, but I do think it's essential that you deal with the entire criminal justice chain. With that said, I think equally important is, first of all, you need to make sure at national level things work well. The whole criminal justice chain must work like a well-oiled machine. And once you have that national capacity established, you also need to make sure that you focus on international level interaction and build capacity so that your national authorities are also able to exchange and interact with their counterparts in other countries. And that's the only way to address the entire illegal trade chain, is to make sure at national level all your authorities interact, they have a collaboration mechanism, they know their legislation, they know what to do, but are also able to speak with their counterparts abroad so that you can respond to wildlife crime. That's a transnational organized crime with criminals very often sitting in your own country, but also in transit and destination countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Mary, can I ask you the same question from a different perspective, obviously?
Okay, I would agree a lot with what Ben has said, but it isn't just the criminal justice system that you need to engage. You also need to look at the private sector. You need to look at media, the role of media, because in order to change things, generally, you need a good narrative. And the people who deliver that narrative are the media. And then, of course, everybody who is in that criminal justice system comes from the community. And so, you know, getting people interested at the community level, in whatever way, whether it's you know, young people's clubs looking at environmental issues, whether it's like the Scouts, you know, that sort of initiative is really important. I think what's also really important is that people actually know why they should care. And different communities will have different reasons for caring. And I've sat in one particular roundtable recently with judges, and they stood up and said, well, why should we care? So you actually need to explain to any given, you know, participants or country where their country fits in the global picture, you know, how important their resources are, you know, what value do their resources have for them as a country, and make them feel invested in actually protecting what they are essentially the custodians of. And I think, you know, sometimes trainings or capacities are targeted way too far above people's heads. Sometimes you have to start really, really low and explain things in a very, very simple way, and then build it up, and then engage the different communities to work together. I think that's the way that capacity building works.
Thank you, Mary. So we have the entire criminal justice chain, the private sector, the media overall. That's a huge amount of capacity building to do. So I have basically two follow-up questions. One is how do we prioritize then, considering we have such a huge audience? And second, which brings me back to part of the elements that we had at the beginning is, so how do you go about these by individual trainings, by institutions? How do you build the capacity, or most likely some sort of interaction of both? But then what do you focus on in which case? So maybe Ben, can I give you the floor about institutions and personal, and then anybody that wants to talk about prioritization?
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, and I think what Mary said is completely right. There's a lot of different role players, and it depends on who you think about in this whole process, where you'll focus your efforts. You know, if you think about enforcement, it's the criminal justice system. But if you think of all the other things that needs to happen, it's very important to focus on your private public sector and all those. In terms of how do you engage all these actors, I think that's where the issue of collaboration comes in. There's no way a single entity or a single agency can engage effectively with all these different role players. And I think that's why it's so important that we always say there's a need for collaboration. If I think of the criminal justice sector, for example, again, coming back to IQIC, where we have the 5 intergovernmental agencies with the core mandates globally to work with customs, police and law enforcement authorities, as well as the judiciary. I think it's great. It's a great example of how we leverage on the skills and the expertise of the different partners to complement the work of each other. And that needs to spill over into private sector, into civil society, so that we can really have an impact and work across the board with all these very, very important role players in the response to wildlife crime.
Thank you so much. Prioritization, anybody wants to take that on? How do you, I mean, coordination and coherence is something that I want to touch upon in a bit. Maybe we'll discuss prioritization a little bit later, because I also have a very long list of questions to go through. One of the next ones that I also wanted to discuss was, so we're talking about law enforcement, criminal justice. And a whole spectrum of actors. And so let's focus for a second only on law enforcement and criminal justice actors. Do they share an approach? I'm assuming there's elements that are shared and there's elements that are different. So what are the similar elements? What are the differences in dealing with these two types of audiences? Carlos, maybe I give you the floor on this one first.
Okay, well, as Mary said before, there is a big deal with it. There's a lot of work to do in it, unfortunately. The judicial sector is the most crucial element in the force made to ensure that police investigations in the criminal field conclude with the optimal outcome of dismantling criminal organizations, which is probably the place they play an essential work. Without a clear understanding of the needs that judicial authorities have within their procedures, it's difficult to achieve the desired outcome. I mean, sometimes we have to understand them, to understand the procedure correctly in order to give them what they really need. There's our part, but there's another part that they have to do for us. Nevertheless, this is why the collaboration is essential through the process. In Spain, for example, specifically, there's an special environmental prosecutor's office with specialized prosecutors deployed throughout the territory. In addition to this special prosecutor's office located in Madrid, Seprona, we have a permanent liaison unit to ensure that this coordination is carried out in a proper way. This unit belongs to mine unit. In this collaboration, communication, coordination, we invite the prosecutor's office and judge, sometimes also judge, to be part of as speakers and as students, mainly as speakers, unfortunately, in our training programs. That's the way we try to engage them. it is considered essential to understand each other's perspective and needs so that this necessary collaboration can be productive as possible. A perfect example of this collaboration that is needed is the necessary communication in combining sometimes the prosecutor's office of an extreme necessity of initiation economic investigations parallel with any other judicial proceedings regarding environmental crimes. Only this way we can impact the investigated criminal organizations. If we can make their activities less economically viable for them, we will begin to gain ground in the fight against environmental crimes. Essentially, the change in mindset is to start viewing these types of crimes, environmental crimes, as economic offenses and begin working in that direction. That's my particular point of view. And I think that we have a lot to do in this area.
Thank you so much. Mary, if you can help us with some ideas also of how, and examples perhaps of working with both or either and how they are similar and different.
So I think with either of the target audiences, you need to speak their language. And obviously, NGOs are not necessarily equipped with the jargon that's required. Police officers don't want to talk to NGOs, they want to talk to their peers. And so it's really important that you bring in the right people to engage with the target audience. I think it's also really important to understand the actual protocols and bureaucracy and challenges that are at play. We all would like to see a multi-agency approach in tackling illegal wildlife trade or any environmental crime. But we have to accept the reality that often there is conflict between the relevant agencies, particularly in certain regions. And, you know, one agency will want to be the one that does everything and doesn't want to collaborate, even though we all recognize that not one agency can tackle the problem on their own. So, you know, part of what we try and do is understand that dynamic and try and find a way to bring some of those players together. And also it's quite interesting in some of the workshops that we've run and the roundtables that we've convened, once you put everyone together in a room from the different agencies, it's amazing how quickly they get together and work together to solve a problem. Yet when it comes to the real world, it's a very different story. And that's partly because at the senior level, there are blockages there, which may be politically driven, economically driven. So those are real sort of considerations when you're trying to deliver any kind of capacity building. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that you need to rely on lived experience. The people in the room have their own experiences. And if you can bring relevant material to them that makes them feel invested in the work that you're trying to engage them in, I think that speaks volumes in terms of their actual enthusiasm and motivation. And one thing we didn't answer, Hani, was about the rotational issue. So one of the things, and I think the pandemic has taught us that you can do lots of things remotely. So I think, you know, in your trainings or your capacity buildings to sort of develop manuals, develop rapid reference guides in the target language. Videos are really useful, or online, self-learning tools, mentoring. And one thing perhaps that we've been thinking about is to create clinics where you might, as part of a mentoring process, have a regular slot every quarter for people that you've trained or built capacity with or shared skills with, to get in touch and raise concerns, you know, online. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of also equalizing, as we were saying before, so that then we can customize in a more custom made. So I heard things about communication, and it's not only within different agencies, but it's also, among the leaders essentially, and the different audiences that we're trying to reach, of course. But also there was this thing about putting people in a room, because it's about humanizing also the way we work together. And that's it's easier to block things when we don't know who we're talking to, I guess. Now, I originally also mentioned the issue of innovation, and I'm purposely not calling it technology, because I think not all innovations are technology. Some are, but not all. But of course, it's a big thing now with the AI and everybody worried about that, and drones and all of these. Some of which are prohibitively expensive, so they cannot be implemented in many countries. Some are actually very, very usable. So, what are good examples that you can share on innovation? Hopefully, some of them linked to technology, but all types of innovation in the delivering of capacity building for either detection, disruption, deterrence, whatever. Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, because I think this question has two parts. I think, is that right, in terms of, you mentioned the disruption, so the actual operational side, but then also actually in the training side. And I think on the operational side, I think we mentioned it. There's this concept, I think, this S curve. I think people might have come across. Drones is a really good example where you have that hype phase where there's a lot of interest, and I'm sure everyone here who's a practitioner has at some point been involved in a drone project, it feels like. But then they kind of, slump because I've heard someone say, the next time someone talks to me about a drone, I'm going to shoot them or something like that, because they don't work in every situation. But then some technology stabilizes. So, imagine doing our work in the forest if we didn't have GPS devices. I have no idea how people can navigate in the forest. These are game-changing technologies for what we do. You've already heard my stance on crime science. I do think that is an innovation. A law enforcement leader who's given a new tool, a new piece of equipment. Well, we heard from Dan, the offenders are definitely going to adapt. That's one thing we know about crime. But if you teach that law enforcement, how to evaluate their own progress of their performance, and they can actually then innovate and stay ahead of the offenders. There are really good case studies of that. Teams that are innovating because they have an adaptive management cycle built into their operations, and it's incredible. They can stay ahead of the offenders like that. But on the capacity building side, you mentioned AI. I'm going to go there. So if anyone wants to run out of the room because AI is taking over the world, then that's fine. Okay, now is your trigger warning. I'll start with the technology. So I mentioned that S curve. I think e-learning and the digital learning, I think everyone had fatigue during COVID, I'm guessing, right? But I think we need to recognize that it's accelerated the uptake of digital learning by about 5 years or something like that. And I personally do feel that is entering that stabilization curve. You saw in our slides there that in our program, we're able to deliver a lot more content because we can deliver it at the pace that the learner wants to go. So I'm not talking about webinars, because I know they serve a purpose, but I'm not saying about a program that's 100% webinars. But just like you said, Mary, those resources are online and made available for officers to dip into when they're ready. When they come to those in-person trainings, which we know we need, they know the legislation, they know all the foundation knowledge. So the in-person training is the interaction, the kind of testing and the application. So I promised you a little bit on AI. I don't know if people have been tracking this, but there is this whole idea about AI coaches. We are not far away from having, I mentioned feedback in my presentation, AI trainers that would be able to give customized feedback to children. I'm not an educator, but also to our officers, right? So imagine, that is exciting to me. If we could actually have they try to do something, and every single person we're training, there's thousands of people that get trained by all these organizations here, are getting really tailored one-to-one feedback. If that's being managed by a really competent training team as part of a coordinated project, I think that's going to that could be really exciting.
I think the other thing is it's not so much AI, but I suppose it's getting close to it. Is during COVID we saw a lot of the illegal trafficking go online, and the traders were still engaging online. In terms of the volume of work for EIA, it went up. It didn't go down. And so what we've now found is that we've started providing, I suppose, skill sharing for certain agencies on how to actually conduct open source investigation and intelligence analysis. We've done this in one country where we started off with a very basic training exercise, if you like, or capacity building, just to raise awareness and introduce the issue and the problems. And subsequently, we've done some more targeted work, and they've actually asked for us to help them to look at their OSINT specifically. So we've been doing that, and I think that's an area that probably needs a lot more attention. It does require sort of technical resources, which not everybody has, but it is one way to build motivation and capacity with any organization. And the one thing I didn't mention, which is really, really important and is one of the underlying principles of learning, is whatever capacity you bring to the table, or skills that you share, or training that you give, you have to do remedial work. You have to come back to it again. You can't just parachute in and parachute out. That's not how people learn in any sort of capacity.
Carlos? Yeah, I fully agree with you, but we have to, regarding the EA, we all have in our school life many kind of teachers. But at the end of the day, you remember that give you warm, that provide you their own experience, that give you. Yes. EA, of course, will give you everything because the knowledge is in the internet. It is the source. But this I think that this you can substitute it. Of course, we have to move on it, but we can't replace it. You can replace it in any way. Yeah. There's room for everything, I assume.
It's a helper, not a replacement.
Well, I would like to give you some, because another thing that that is very important is that these tools have to be useful for people. You get crazy in my own unit when you tell them that we're gonna buy a drone, we're gonna buy this submarine. Yes, they want everything. They want everything. I've seen this in the internet. No. You don't need it. We kind of let's buy things that we need, and there's some of course there are something that very, very expensive, and we have many research investigation close to with Mitego that they provide us many things. They provide many tools, and we have some examples that I would like to share with you. Short. Just one example. I'm going to give you the best I think we have. It's a project called IDESA that is fully funded by Miteco, but these people is with us, working together with us. They are civilians, they are investigators, and this project. The goal is to achieve the identification and dating of ivory pieces using Raman spectroscopy. Oh, thank you. And infrared techniques. I hope that in a few years, not too many, I would like to think, we could be able to return to this forum to share the final results of this scientific research. That is very interesting for us because we believe that we have the ivory, everything involves everything. It came up in this forum because it's a very, very difficult thing to fight in Africa, and we have the tool to start doing better in Europe with this.
We need to move to questions, but can I do 1 minute? 1 minute finals.
Yes.
Because I will just separate questions of. Okay. So I have 2 questions for whoever wants to take it. 1 minute. How to better coordinate and deconflict. That's essential when we're talking about capacity building, since we all do capacity building. And the second is we have been hearing also government concerns, and I think Mary touched upon this as well, on CSO's engagements on law enforcement and what's the mandate on this. So how could we better work together for a more improved sustainable approach? So 1 minute, Jonathan, I think you wanted to take the coordination and deconflicting.
Yeah, I'll keep it super quick. Astrid said this right at the very beginning, and trust. Trust is great. We do need to kind of build that trust, but we're all busy. And it's not that we don't want to work together, we're busy. So I think the really helpful thing that the donors and funders could do would be to really encourage joint projects, joint funding, joint collaborations, and because that forces people to work together because they've got a project meeting to go to with those people. So yeah, I think I would say trust and those kind of practical solutions, as well as the language around shared targets, shared performance, and like meetings like this where we could actually compare progress from one approach to another approach. So yeah, that needs more work and thought, but I think those would help.
Thank you. Ben, perhaps I can give you the second one. 1 minute.
Yeah, from my side, just I think you really need to look at the type of activity. If it's core law enforcement, I think there's a limited role for the CSO sector. But there's many other places where they can be very valuable and contribute. One thing I think about is again, talking about the iQuick Toolkit. We call it our iQuick Toolkit, but iQuick had the convening power to bring together law enforcement, CSOs, academia, and all of them contribute to the content of that tool. So I think that's how we all work together to make it's not an iQuick tool, it's a tool for all of us. I think something else that we've been trying to do more and more lately is coordination calls for key countries to make sure we speak to different role players and see what they are doing so that we can find synergies between things we are doing. But again, I think coming back to how can we best collaborate is let's do evidence-based assessments of what's the need. Let's create a work plan and let's allocate tasks from that work plan to all the different role players in the places where they are best suited to contribute to what's needed.
Thank you so much. Now we go over to questions from.
Yeah, and we did have 2 people figuring out how to use Slido. Yeah. So I'll read. Yeah, I'll read the questions. But I don't think we have time for all of the panelists to answer all the questions. So jump in if you have a particular answer. The first question is, what's the very best way, in your opinion, to measure the impact of capacity building efforts, and how should you not do it? What is the worst way to measure capacity building efforts? That's question number 1. Keep that in your mind. Question number 2 is, what's the best way to identify participants who will be receptive to capacity building and will get the most long-term benefit from skills gain? Again, what's the best way to identify participants? So those are the 2 questions online. And thank you to those of you online.
I'll answer one. Okay, so we've recently conducted some capacity building in said country with an agency, and as a result of that capacity building, they have taken the training on board. They've used some of the intelligence that we've shared with them that they've been able to analyze, and they've actually incorporated that into an enforcement action, and that for us is demonstrated impact. What's not impact is a list of tick boxes, X number of workshops conducted, X number of people sitting in a training room. And sometimes impact is really difficult, and sometimes less is more, actually.
Second one, anybody?
Do you want me to repeat it? How do you identify who the best participants will be, who will benefit the most?
Well, let me try, but that's a difficult question.
Just relaying the Slido.
No, I think, what happens in many cases, especially when you do trainings, is that the trainees are nominated by government. So you only have a limited capacity to influence who pitches up there, right? And I think that's the difficult part of the question, because you can't be prescriptive to a country and say, well, you nominated Mr. A, I want Mr. B. It just doesn't work that way. What we are doing in some of the activities we are doing, for example, again, through the IQUIC consortium, is we do try to engage the countries where there's a reasonable chance for success, meaning that there must be a willingness from the country to really do something. Some countries are, weird enough, even though they need help, are not receptive to receive help, and you're wasting your time to work with those. So I think it's trying to identify, first of all, those countries that are really receptive to help and to support and to willing to learn, and to focus on them as a priority.
Can I just add, which is just, there are certain circumstances, it's a really great question, and Ben, I like your answer. There are certain circumstances where we can select the officers. So one of the things with the Wildlife Crime Leadership Initiative was, because it's a promotion program and having that integrated, it gives you an extra level of filter where actually our government partners run internal selections, so assessments and the sort of thing you'd want to identify the people that you're going to invest in. So yeah, when there's a mechanism within the agency, which as Ben's been saying, you have to really understand, we can leverage those to try and get those really high caliber officers who are going to go on to be leaders, and then they can be unlocking selection of future leaders as well.
And if I may, just because I was going to go on the same route. It's just sharing commitments. So if you're engaging, and it goes in line with what you were saying earlier about shorter and longer involvement. So the commitment cannot be you'll just go to the training, neither from the people doing or the institution doing the capacity building, nor from the participants. So some of the most successful capacity buildings that I've participated as a participant is when there is a commitment. I will have to do an action plan. I will have to continue working on this. There is an expectation of A, B, C, and D from both sides. So it's starting with something, continuing on mentoring, making sure that both the institution and the individuals involved in the exercises are getting something out of it that is useful for what they are working on, and that are serving the goals that we are trying to engage in.
Questions from within the room? Yes.
Thank you. João Loureiro from Portugal. I was wondering with which hat I should make the question. After working, well, most 40 years with issues with different hats, I think I can agree with almost things that you already said, important things. But I have a comment that lead to a question. With cooperation and trying to deal with conflicts, don't you think that one of the things that need to be done, and most of the time is not, is to find a leader? To find the one who then can respected leader, then all the other can work together. That we try to do to raise in Portugal. And if you find in this judicial case a prosecutor, a right one, almost all the chain like that will be working together. This is a question, or a comment to question, if I find it's important. One other thing that Mary said, you need to have, when trained, to have the proper language. When we train judge, there is a judge sharing the process. He talked with us before and trying to explain the language that we should use. And then, of course, we want active and expert and to do some expertise. And I think we miss one stakeholder that very test, that is politics. If we don't make awareness of them, we don't have the research. And then I have a question for Jonathan, I think, if I understand well in the beginning. You said that in your evaluation of your work, you said that perhaps you could be changing for a short-term trainings for a long-term training, because it's a little bit confusing for me, because most of the time the target audience is not the same. And because of the rotativity that you talk, short-term training are dealt for people, then they leave. But so we need to directly select the one that we're going to have a long term. So one question is, when you do your evaluation, how do you balance that? Thank you.
first question around the kind of leaders as well, right? Starting into the second one, right? Did someone put on leaders? Should I do the second one? Yeah, I'll answer that. Yeah, I only had a few minutes to talk about that, so thank you. You really pointed out. I think it really goes to everything we've been saying here about having that strategy that really recognizes the right need. So, you know, it's similar to what Mary's saying. I think many of us who've been doing this would recognize the model in the past as being how many thousand people can we get a short training in? And if that is your metric, if that, you know, you measure, you get what you measure. So that you're going to make those courses as short as possible to get as many people. And there are times when you need those short courses, like they are valuable. But what I would prefer though is that we are to your first question, that long-term training allows you to build leaders, and there's soft skills training in there, like management skills. It's often overlooked in law enforcement. So in terms of that balance, I think you would, by doing that analysis that we've been talking about, I think you will identify where you do need short-term skills, for example, digital forensics or open source. But if I would love that to be led by the agency. I would love that to be led by a leader in the agency who's gone through a long program, understanding how to lead their own capacity and analysis, and they're the ones identifying the right officers because they understand the strategic need for a particular operation or a particular project. So I think the short answer is a bit of both. But I think currently the sector has only really been doing the short-term training, without the long-term training. And I think the long-term training will unlock really impactful short-term training, I think. Yeah.
If I understand your other question correctly, it's about identifying a leader to lead, essentially, a common approach or a multi-agency approach or a multi-sectoral approach to unite it. And I want to comment on that sometimes the problem with that is that make it person specific and person dependent. So we need to identify many leaders that can work together, and that's part of the complicated element. If we focus on one leader, maybe can lead us in the transformation, but then what happens if the person moves on, something happens, then we go back. So that's one comment I had on that. Not that I'm against it, I'm just saying we always have to have backup plans. Now, before finishing, if I may, I just want to recap 6 ideas that came of today, because I like to always leave people thinking with that. So let me start from the end to the beginning. I think it was Mary or Jonathan, I can't remember, who talked about joint projects and talk about the collaboration and developing the trust, because we're all human beings. And it is really hard to do that, by the way. The hardest it is, however, the most effective it'll be in generating trust, and that is CSOs, law enforcement, communities and law enforcement. We haven't had time to get into indigenous communities and the need to work with, a closer engagement between law enforcement that is local. So the first one is that need to go back to developing trust and joint projects as a mechanism, and joint approaches, maybe it's not projects, but approaches as a mechanism to do that. Second, the fact that innovation can be many things, including what are we doing and or how we do the capacity building. But it could be particularly useful in equalizing, which is what I'm calling this first element of getting everybody to a similar stage so that we can then customize. We know that customizing is essential for a capacity building now that is effective. But if we don't equalize first point for everybody, and this is where digital technologies help us, or at least that's what I understood. Third element, or fourth, I can't remember anymore. It's communication and not only talking the same language and talking to our different audiences and understanding the reason, the why of what we're doing that, but also criminal organizations prey on information. So if we are not exchanging information internationally, they are. And they are much better at this point of exchanging information than we are. So that's why they have right now the lead room. And that's what we need to work on, both internally within our institutions, but also internationally at sharing that information and communication in a different way so that we can be more quicker in doing this. Two more things and then I'm done. Needs and evidence. So yes, we need a needs assessment, but we also need a non-subjective needs assessment. We need, different ways of understanding the needs assessment so that we actually, don't end up with the wants of a few. rather to the needs that both practitioners and institution needs. And finally, understanding that we need to work both with individuals and with institutions. And with institutions, sometimes that means processes. And we joke sometimes that I quick, sometimes it's not that quick, because we work on processes. And processes take time and take patience and need to develop trust and need to develop that connection. So we need to be aware of all of that if we are going. So there is no quick solutions, and that's part of what we are talking about. And a good capacity building won't be quick. It will take time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Hani, Ben, Jonathan, Mary, and Carlos for your input. It's never fun to be the timekeeper. Yeah, off the stage. Come on, folks. Yeah. But thank you. A very rich discussion, and we will have time in the reception to ask some more questions. For a somewhat lighter moment, we are going to now show a short video of from the Niassa Special Reserve in Mozambique. The European Union is currently supporting an initiative led by ourselves, WCS, in close partnership with ANAC, that's the National Administration of Conservation Areas of Mozambique, working with communities on building resilient ecosystems and combating wildlife trafficking in the largest conservation area of Mozambique. So I don't know if somebody is responsible for dimming the lights, not too dim, there's no napping allowed, but just a little bit so we can see the video. Thank you.
Neja pangu yetu taya showa jaji kuna maana kututana kwa kukubereka kuti kwanako rujituishie kuchijiji ni kumariri kuna kukamutizana kuna maana kina kijiji ni kumariri kweku kututana kuno kubere mpera gantungwe ndaweja kwera njenu moja kwete kuntuta nombe jula akwete nomba ntute sampano ya tujivizi Neja pangu yetu taya showa jaji kuna maana kututana kwa kukubereka kuti kwanako rujituishie kuchijiji ni kumariri kuna kukamutizana kuna maana kina kijiji ni kumariri kweku kututana kuno kubere mpera gantungwe ndaweja kwera njenu moja kwete kuntuta nombe jula akwete nomba ntute sampano ya tujivizire akordu kuchijiji ni kumariri yakuti tukwete kukamuchiziana kereka kamuchiziane kala kwa namakapo gako ya lyamizire yakuti kwa namakapo likapo lyamizire yaunera kuti kwekula kajinjire kama kobili kuchijiji kokula tukwete limite kija limite jia tujivizie limite ja kuti upande wine wewe mpaka ula kuno tuwijije conservation ko tumana tulanjije nyama akuno kuine kuno tulimeje wachi na kijiji sampano ndavija kuika ataliva la kumariri kuno nali nkwenda jenda nikokula ali nkuione chindu ye kwenda ichenene ni limite ja tukure hospitali njija limite jia kukopo kama kobili mkati maje limite jia digira makobili ga kwa deretu tugapata abantu bakuchijiji lya tatu ngosala kuti pambamba papa makobili kuinjira kila mwezi namboka jinjire kaga makobili gaga pambamba papa kutokana enkazu janga wa inyama mpera gamula ndembo lizimba chizuvi litunu ele nyama ila kama watu irespectere ngai ulaga pachijiji wesempere makobili gakuaga utezie uliga kukwela nambo nyama ila tukai respectere ditwaulagaga ile nyama ya chawagata litunu limo au lisimba limo gigala makobili gakutenda uliga kupunguka nenteri muja kushikola chibana betu wakati kuikukwela izame ndabija kuba ni izame makobili gakutenda uliga kuaga kuizira nambo tande wanga ulaga inyama yayi wejijiveleko mungokwe jetu kuna maana banku jetu jelejo inyamayo ndavi jitukulaga inyama yayi kuna maana otuko halibu makobili getu ku banku sampano chine chakwe papopo kamera ndaweje tukutega weni kuzungulaga wewe kwenda kuiva kamera zanga tukwimanyira kuti ndaweje tukuiva kamera zyazi makobili getu tukuhalibu tukukoya bana chembulu papopo makobili getu tukupungula tukupata panandi nine akunga tukwimanyira kuti ndaweje tukuiva kamera zyazi kuna maana parte ja conservasa ujo tukusaka kujiulaga makobili gaga nagaga kuinjira pa kijiji papa makobili ganga kwamba kuinjira yoyo iga makobili gaga kama gakuinjira hapa gakuinjira ntande wa chichi wa conservation kuna maana wegoza inyama nyama ile ndayo tukuigoza ichenene makobili gaga kutenda uli gakuwaga jinjire pa kijiji
nana masango jadi blokuji ubanganya masango ni masango gango bali gapa pa chilumba pa chilumba shashi chili chakwapo chila bantu yani maturista akuma ilambo ya pasa kweka ku visitari amumu ajad zervaji na jiblokuji temaka kweka la shale ndo wala bas nitokuwa kwa peche tamwitinji kuilole nyama tukenda yo fulani wamuni tukola sungu baba ila tutalichire ni nyama ila ejinji yaveleli nkusofere kuiputa puta majambasi gaga china wiwa sano ila ni jimi tande wajibwe kuji
nengulilani kwa Musa Yasini ngusoma ku chikola cha Kumbamba tulia kunotu nikusoma site maklase tukujishukuru mariri jikutu kamuchirano petu kutenda kusoma kutioka ni kuliaga basi tukuja kumuzi tuninkusengwa kwa hiyo tukutenda asante mariri juangali sonia kuvechita ya ijinji
We purposely tried to avoid killing you all with PowerPoint presentations. We snuck a few in there, but I hope this format was more engaging for everybody. You know, there's so much more to discuss. We only had a short amount of time and we didn't want to, you know, bore you all. But I think, you know, the key next steps is that we continue these discussions. I think what I really valued from some of those discussions was the honesty. We did start to talk about, well, I don't actually know, or this was a failure that we didn't do. And I think that is the kind of conversation that we need to do a lot more of. I would encourage those of you who are staying for the reception to take the opportunity to, you know, pull on a panelist and try and ask them more questions and to share context to discuss that. We will obviously be sharing some notes from this. We'll share the recordings. For anybody, you know, please feel free to share that. You know, some of my reflections on this, you know, on behaviour change in that panel, it was really good to hear, you know, to see some of the collaborations that are taking place, but also, and to see the local representation that we now have in that area, but also to see how we're starting to learn from other sectors, you know, from this, from Toby's side, from Behavioural Insights and kind of quite well-established government-led nudge unit type approaches. It's good to see us starting to take on some of those practices. You know, when it comes to crime science, you know, let's be honest, we literally scraped the surface of some very heavy areas. But again, you know, I was struck to think like how much there is we can learn from crime scientists in our work. And I really, really encourage all of us to start to think how we bridge that gap between academics and practitioners, because I think we can all benefit. And on capacity building, again, you know, that term of it sometimes would mean that you would walk out of the room like, oh, I'm not going to that. What a boring conversation to have. But I don't think that was what it was. I think finally we're starting to challenge ourselves with, is this the right way? Is our capacity building actually training the right things? Are we training people how to be better at reducing wildlife crime? And are we doing it in a way that is meaningful and impactful? So I'm really happy to see that we're challenging some of the traditional approaches and thinking more strategically how to do that. But overall, what I took from all of these sessions and also from some of the questions is there is growing collaboration. I do think that is a thing. You know, I think there's been moments in our time where there's been a lot of separation and a lot of frustration between partners, but I'm starting to see, certainly in our world, you know, implementers who are working on counter-wildlife trafficking are starting to collaborate a lot more, whether that be private sector, CSOs, local communities, indigenous peoples, intergovernment organizations, as well as governments. And I think it's critically needed. You know, I don't think there's any doors ever closed on that. And even hearing from like Spanish, to hear that great example of through that action plan, Miteco and Seprona started to work together and had impact. I think it's everywhere we can start to see that. Because it's so important. I think as Astrid kind of spoke to in her opening comments, we are at a very critical time right now for our natural world, you know, and I think trafficking of wildlife really does fit in the middle of many of these crises, whether it be the public health risks that come through trafficking of wildlife through zoonotic diseases, whether it be through biodiversity loss, obviously, but also climate change and what's happening with the climate crisis. You know, if you look at how much ecological integrity is being harmed through the trafficking of wildlife and poaching, that is, you know, making our ecosystems less resilient to the changes that they will probably start to face. And so we really do need to continue this. You know, I think as we are all probably aware, there is some good news happening. We are making progress in our fight against wildlife trafficking, but the last thing we should be doing is settling down and saying, well, good stuff, we'll move on to the next problem. Like, we are so far from that. Like, there are so, you know, maybe there's been progress in some very charismatic species, but my goodness, if you're a songbird or a freshwater turtle or an amphibian right now, it's the worst time for you in terms of the threat. So, you know, we shouldn't be taking our foot off the gas. We should be scaling up our efforts and furthering our impact. And so in that regard, you know, from WCS's side, we really welcome that the EU has renewed its action plan against wildlife trafficking, and that there's also talk of upcoming programs around counter wildlife trafficking funded by the EU, both here and globally. And from our side in WCS, we will continue to support the implementation of that action plan as in any way possible that we can, and to also continue these kinds of frank discussions, because I think they're really needed in our sector, particularly around failure and how we can start to have the culture where it's okay to talk about that. And I hope through the EU, that's something that we can do. A few final thank yous before I hand over to Chantal. Firstly, I wanted to thank our hosts here at the Press Club. I think they didn't expect that this was going to be so busy. We didn't expect it either. And so I wanted to thank them for their patience in this being overflowing at the seams, because I don't think that was planned. But it's great to see so much interest in this. I obviously wanted to thank the European Commission, our co-host, and the Spanish Presidency for the Council of the European Union. I wanted to thank you all for being here and kind of spending your afternoon with us, and hopefully do stay for a drink. For those online that figured, particularly those who figured out Slido, kudos to you. You can show me how that works. And for those who are watching this, who recorded it and are now watching it at high speed, if you made it to this point in your recording, also pat yourself on the back. But really, you know, I do think this is such an important issue that it's great to have this kind of event, and I'm, you know, privileged that WCS can be part of it. And so with that, I will look in the room to see whether we have Chantal, who is the head. I say, okay, great. We have Chantal, who's the head of the Environment Sustainable Natural Resource Unit from DG INPAT in the European Commission. Thank you very much for joining us, Chantal.
Good, great name. I must say, I'm really impressed. Thierry, my head of sector, was telling me that, you know, the room was really full. But when I came here and saw that it was still full, I thought you'd have all fleed before I came along. So I'll try not to bore you. I know it's been a very long day, and I think that the discussions have been very rich from what I'm hearing. I mean, I think that really reflects how complex the issue of wildlife trafficking is, and it's good to know that you're really digging down in it, because that's what we need. Now, I think you all probably, we've bored you stiff, but you all know that we've got a huge initiative in Africa called Nature Africa, that's really on the landscape level, where we're operating around key biodiversity areas, and that we've got these three pillars: the conservation side, but also the peace and security and the governance side, and then the livelihoods, which we think are also terribly important. And we think that this is sort of one of the bases to work on, also on preventing wildlife crime. I think the livelihoods we see as extremely important as to develop an alternative job market, to make sure that there are alternatives to poaching for local communities, and that they can see the benefits of actually conserving the biodiversity that they're lucky to live near. It's also going to obviously be supporting surveillance capacity and anti-poaching as well. I mean, it's not just livelihoods, and work with the communities on reducing the conflict, which I think we're hearing more and more. The more that there are problems in some areas, the more you're seeing congregations of different types of wildlife. I mean, think of elephants. I think that's a very easy one. So there we're going to be looking into that. However, that's not the only thing that we're going to be doing, because we really want to go beyond the local landscapes. We acknowledge that that's absolutely not sufficient. I mean, it's one of the things that we should be doing. And I think it's the 4th of October, we're going to our member states to get approval for our new program that really aims to support the strengthening of national capacities, but also to help partner countries fight the wildlife crime at a regional and transcontinental level, to sort of make the connection between the different levels. What we want to do is have a couple of focus countries as well, where we're seeing that these countries have a really important role as either source transit or consumption countries. So that's also going to be one of the sort of the areas that we want to focus on much more, to help them improve their national legislation and their capacities for law enforcement. But we'd also want to see them conducting investigations and improving coordinations between the different agencies that are in charge. So having a meeting this morning with the partners, some of the partners in IQIC, and we were talking about all the different agencies that are involved. You need to get them to work together, which is very important. And then, of course, there's the transboundary cooperation that we think is crucial. So helping countries to actually exchange sensitive information, getting used to working together, to cooperating, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to try and at least put a stop to wildlife trafficking. We're thinking of joint control operations such as Thunder operation, that's organised by the World Customs Organization in collaboration with Interpol. We're also thinking about the support to forensics. We think that's really important to be able to ascertain the origins of the trafficked products. And then we believe it's really essential to join forces on wildlife crime. And for this reason, we are going to continue to support IQIC. That's one of the things that we want to do. However, in addition to that, we really believe that there needs to be more, and we want to make sure that there's an extended collaboration with between international organizations and international NGOs that have acquired a really strong expertise in the area of wildlife crime. And I was, UNODC, CITES representatives, I know in the back of the room, we were talking about that this morning. So that's really, I think, in all our minds, a nice evolution that I'm seeing, and where we really need to be working more all together and sort of really join our forces. And of course, there's the demand side. I mean, demand reduction is continues to be really important. If there's demand, there'll be trafficking. So there, we want to really put some emphasis on that as well, and go into the social science side of it, look at behavioural change. I'm quite keen that we also continue to work on political economy analysis to know who our allies are and who, sort of the ones that aren't our allies, are, so that we really know who we're dealing with. That's something that I find very important. I must admit, social sciences, well, I am a social scientist, so I think it can be quite useful. Not surprising. And then we obviously want to make a link as the European Union between our different actions, because we've got Nature Africa, we would have iQuick and the new program that we're putting forward, but there are also regional programs, and there we're thinking of the Pacto 2.0 program, which is wider and is really looking at all sorts of organized crime in Latin America and Caribbean, and between Latin America, Caribbean and Europe. So there we really want to see how we can collaborate and make sure that these two programs actually talk to each other and build on each other. And of course, we're looking again at how we can work on corruption. We're seeing that, you know, digital is one of our priorities, but digital is also helping with wildlife crime. So we're going to have to integrate that into our way of thinking. And here, the EU also intends to address this through a recent program that's not managed by my DG, but by the Foreign Policy Instrument, which aims to, I think called the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. So it's continuing work that's already being done by FPI. So where we want to really disrupt illicit environmental commodity flows through innovative activities. So we've got, I think, as you can see, quite a wide range of tools that we want to put forward, and we want to see that ours work together, but that we're obviously all supporting you and working with you, because it's only, I think, if we all work together that we'll actually manage to achieve something. And I'll stop here because I think you've had a very long day, but I understand productive. Thank you. Right. Did I hear cocktail from you?
I am not going to make a speech. Just again, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to the organizers, the Commission, Spanish Presidency, my WCS colleagues, and thank you all. And please join us for the reception, and let's all work together to end wildlife trafficking. Thank you.